f***ing go!
Let's go!
Let's f***ing go! Come on! Come on! Let's fucking go! Liquid has done it! They have fun! This is the Race to World First, an event that garners hundreds of thousands of concurrent viewers each and every single season to watch top guilds in the world progress, the brand new raid, and the newest patch inside of World of Warcraft. But it always wasn't like this, though. The analysts, outside raid leaders, theory crafters, add-on developers, casters, organizations with their private chefs, those are all brand new additions. With Race to World First, it's always been about the glory of downing the boss before competition, weeks and days of 16 hours a day of non-stop gameplay. How did we get here, though? Well, this is the history of the Race to World First. And so for this video, we're going to be talking about the Race to World First event, not just all of World First raiding inside of World of Warcraft. And with that being the case, we need to start by talking about how the Race to World First even got started. So to get context about how it was formed, we have to go back to the pre-Race to World First era. And as long as there have been raid bosses, there has been World First raiding. From vanilla all the way up through Legion, there was World First raiding, but there wasn't really eyes on the event itself. And if anything, it was more like taboo to even stream raid progression. Very infrequently did you even have guilds within the top 50 streaming raid progression at all. This kind of ended up changing very late in the Legion through two guilds. The first one, they were Future. After the world's second guild Serenity blew up in Nighthold, basically a lot of the players from this guild ended up forming Future. Some of the most well-known players that you probably know are like Nagura, Sloot, Now, Wolf Disco, Kush, Dr. J, Vikland, just to kind of name a few. And the plan for Future, it was fairly simple. They wanted to stream progression on an evening raiding schedule and kind of just enjoy it for what it was. And for a lot of high-end content creators, this was, a pretty good opportunity for them because they had previously been locked away into higher ranking guilds, but now they have an opportunity to stream. And this guild, they ended up having a pretty good performance in Tomb of Sargeras, getting World 12th Fallen Avatar. They ended up taking a break on KJ, letting their rank slide a little bit. And Taurus, they ended up getting World 23rd. So this guild, they're very good. And like I said earlier, no guild within really the top 50 had actually been streaming progression up until this point. The other guild that ended up kind of breaking away from this mold ended up being the World 4th guild, Alpha. So they really busted down the barriers for top-end raiding, showing the secret phase on Argus, where he gets really big and red and glows. And this kind of changed everybody's perspective for what high-end raiding could be. And historically, raiding had a lot of old school norms holding it back. Similar to the no streaming thing, there was norms where guilds wouldn't release the first kill video until 5 guilds had killed a boss. I also remember when the term video guild actually became popular in Legion, where basically if you progged a boss with ample amounts of world first videos out, you were a video guild. Needless to say, there were a lot of norms in 2017, and prior to that, that kind of made the world first scene what it was, but at the same time, it set us up for the Race to World First era. So, Battle for Azeroth. We move into Battle for Azeroth, and we have some pretty exciting news. The defending Race to World First champions Method have decided that they are going to stream progression during Battle for Azeroth's first raid, Uldir. They ended up having 3 players that would be live from the Red Bull Gaming Sphere in London, UK. Those players were Sko, Genji, and Narcoles. This would kind of be the first look under the hood of World First raiding and what it really could be. And taking kind of a look out at the landscape of what the World First scene really looked like, it looked kind of bleak going into Battle for Azeroth. Paragon, they had died. Exorcist had taken a pretty significant step back in terms of their roster post Taurus. Serenity, like I said earlier, they were dead. And so it kind of looked like it was just ripe for the taking for Method, that they were going to have pretty much no competition.
What's changed? What made it possible now, all these years later?
I guess you could start with saying the first one is that in general, there isn't as much competition in the raiding scene as there was in the past. That's obviously a big one.
And Method at this time, they were also going pretty hardcore for the expansion launch. They were requiring 3 characters minimum for splits, but a lot of players were maintaining a 4th alt for splits. This is probably funny if you're kind of looking at how players are running 15 characters in 2026, but having that many characters leveled and geared in 2018 is a big deal. Another thing that's kind of important to know about the Race to World First event is that Method is going to be streaming without comms. This is going to end up changing in the future, but for the first few tiers that we're going to be talking about the Race to World First, just know that no comms is going to be the norm.
Voice communications, not fully shown. Obviously we're going to be chatting in private, what we should do. Because, okay, you can still watch the stream, you can still see the weak auras, but you don't understand fully everything, I think,
That's what I
just
come
from
in.
that.
That's what I come about.
So with all of that set up, the self-named world first race begins. It's about as expected. Method looks dominant, and there is no other competition, realistically. And that's kind of a lie, on multiple fronts. First off, the 5th boss of the instance, Fetid Devourer, ends up being literally unkillable. Corpuscle ads on this fight just had way too much HP. Perfect play wouldn't really allow you to have enough DPS to kill them in time. It was very clearly overtuned, and it was not particularly close. And the second lie is that there wasn't really competition. And at this time, a relatively unknown North American guild named Limit had decided that they wanted to go a little bit harder in Uldir than they had in the past. They had been US first for a while now, but they were raiding evenings only. However, it looks like their schedule has changed and they're doing a full day raid schedule. But at the same time, they're notably not streaming. Nobody really knows a bunch about Limit at this time, nor is it known how long they're going to be able to keep up with Method. But both of the guilds were deadlocked onto Fetid Devourer, and with 2 nerfs to Fetid Devourer, both Method and Limit are finally able to down the dog after 133 attempts and move further on into Uldir. Then Method and Limit are trading blows, where Method downs Zool with a world first nice 5 sub-rogue strategy. Limit ends up killing the penultimate boss, Mithrax, world first on a Saturday, with some really cheeky intermission strategies where they force spawn the ads on a rock, proving that not streaming actually has a lot of advantages. And that ends up being the strategy that Method ends up adopting and killing the boss later with. However, while Limit did end up killing Mithrax first, that is just the penultimate fight. And at this time, the first to the moon, first to G'huun meme is born. NA basically at this point had not had a world first in-boss kill since the Heart of Fear in Mist of Pandaria. And at the same time, a lot is kind of on the line for Method here. This was the first time streaming world first progression. If Method ends up losing, there is a high degree of likelihood that we just kind of end up going back into the shadows where world first progression may never be streamed again. It kind of depends on what ends up happening with sponsors and how successful this event ends up being. So yeah, Sunday comes and goes, and we finally get 2 more guilds killing Mithrax with Exorcism Method. Vantis runes also at this time had been used basically for all the Race World First contending guilds. So Vantis runes at this point were also criminally overpowered. They were 5% versatility, aka 5% increased damage dealt, and 2.5% damage reductions. Most of these Vantis runes were not saved for G'huun, instead being opted to use on the wall, which was Fetid Devourer all those days earlier. But realistically, with the Mithrax kills, it's only kind of a 2-horse race between Method and Limit, and we're kind of in the dark for how leading guild Limit is doing on G'huun. However, we do see what Method is up to. 4 Warlocks were basically required on that fight, and progression is steady. Unfortunately, though, for Method, it seems like there may be a snag in the plans. G'huun is hard. And Method, their best attempt pre-reset is 4%. And this is the first time this ends up happening. NA Realms notably had their resets lock out 16 hours prior to European Realms, meaning that something crazy can happen, where Limit can enter the raid on Tuesday, get their Vantis runes unlocked, get their chests that you have in BFA, and get the additional gear from the previous reclear. And we saw that Method earlier had a 4% wipe. This means that, honestly, if Method is able to actually use their Vantis runes on G'huun, then G'huun would have already previously died. And if the North American guild is at the exact same point, you know, this is like a near guaranteed world first for the upstart guild. And this is a situation where if Limit is anywhere near where Method are, this should be a near guaranteed world first and their first tier of trying to push for this. That is until the Extend incident. All right, so explain to me the Extend incident all the way back in the day on G'huun. What exactly happened?
So basically, they got G'huun like really, really low. Yeah, it was extremely close on G'huun, and they just knew if we extend, or not extend this, if we kill this, we get world first. First time in NA in forever. The lockout comes up, they can either re-clear, they know Method is really close, or they can do a little risky extending of the lockout, meaning they don't have to re-clear. In that time, Blizzard made some changes to the Vantis runes. They made changes to that so you didn't get as much versatility, and basically made the fight just like 1%, 2% harder. And that was kind of the difference between killing it right after the extension or not.
So as you can probably tell, Method ends up winning on stream. They down G'huun after 285 attempts.
They end up having north of 150,000 viewers watching them kill Gahun, and the pilot for the Race to World First is greenlit, springboarding us forward into the future. And other good news, Limit's GM at the time, Maximum, announces on Twitter that they're going to be going whole hog for the next tier, meaning that there was going to be good competition for back-to-back-to-back World First Race champions Method. And now moving into the next season, everything is bigger and better with the Race for World First. The competition's more fierce with both Limit and Method, committed to going hard versus one another. Method's also dedicating to putting on a larger scale production with bigger sponsors. They're also going to have more casters, more players at the venue, and even renamed the event to the Race to World First, which honestly, this has a better sound than the World First Race, admittedly. On top of that, there's even me casting the event. Anyway, talking about the landscape of the race a little bit post-Gahun. Limit's still going to be raiding off stream, but dedicated to pushing for World First once more. We also kind of know that they already have the promise and potential to win given all the drama surrounding Gahun. But Method has the experience, and that has to play into the thought process between, both of the guilds. World First raiding, it kind of comes down to who can kill the final boss as fast as possible, and it's always about doing everything you can, asterisk, that's not an exploit, double asterisk. Sometimes it's an exploit, but we'll talk about that later. This was also very involved prior to the release of Battle of Dazar'alor, as both guilds were going harder on farm and split characters. Additionally, there was also a cheeky piece of heroic gear that could be available to NA Alliance from a quest through the goated content of War Mode PvP. And obviously, Limit at the time took this opportunity to throw down $1,500 worth of gold for one piece of hero tracker gear on 51 characters. And European fans at the time, they were pretty salty. They stated that this is just another disadvantage on top of the 16 hours that EU has, and this would never allow them to win or something. Basically, it was just free gear after all, and that's where the picture of the famed guild, "This game is bad," comes from. So this is kind of all the setup that we need for pre-BOD. Once Battle of Dazar'alor comes out, it's all pretty clear that the raid is quite a bit easier than Uldir was, with no mid-tier walls at all. Method ends up waking up in Limit. They're already on the penultimate fight in Stormwall Blockade. Everybody kind of assumed that Mekatork and Rastakhan were going to be very challenging due to lore implications that kind of came out prior to this raid. At the same time, Rastakhan ended up having a cheese strat for the intermission, and Mekatork was actually hard. It ended up having a pretty insane amount of heal checks and pass-fail mechanics due to bombs and LOS. Method ended up stinking it up on Mekatork and ended up taking 8 hours for an encounter that only took Limit at the time 3. In modern Race to World First, this would likely be race losing, especially for a fairly trivial boss. It's all good though, as we have a pretty hard penultimate encounter, right? Well, that was also wrong. Stormwall Blockade was actually quite a bit easier than Mithrax from the previous season, and by the time Method had reached Stormwall Blockade, Limit had already killed it. Yay! And so now, guilds end up making it onto the end boss, Jaina Proudmoore. And with Limit raiding in the dark, reaching the boss far earlier, they should have a very significant advantage. There was kind of one weird thing that caught guilds off guard with Jaina Proudmoore, though. So previously, you could actually use one singular immunity, Ice Block, in order to be able to remove her Chilling Touch debuff. This is like the main source of rot damage throughout the entirety of the encounter. This meant that mages were going to be incredibly powerful on Jaina and worth gearing throughout your mythic progression. However, during Mythic Week, Blizzard ended up slamming down a hotfix to how Ice Block worked on that Chilling Touch debuff on Jaina, meaning that all the gear that both Method and Limit that ended up giving to mages, it was completely irrelevant. Mage isn't like the worst DPS in the game this season, but you would probably not have prioritized them for gear. And both Limit and Method are not happy about this. They had made pretty drastic comp allocations due to this. At the same time, it's pretty even playing field, and Jaina, well, she was really hard. She also ended up having a quirk where bloodlusting her would end up causing her to ice block herself during the duration of bloodlust, meaning that there's only one time that you can actually lust on her during the fight. Her intermissions, those were brutal, and they actually took days of real time to actually progress, as the technical nuance of getting to these intermissions and dealing with these intermissions was pretty high. And so all this for Jaina Proudmoore is to say hard boss. For progression purposes, Stormwall Blockade died like Wednesday for Limit, Thursday for Method, and we continue to push on into the reset. Monday, it rolls around, and Jaina Proudmoore, she's still alive. Method 300 pulls in. Limit's unknown as to like where they are. how deep into the fight they are. And publicly, Method is actually trying to progress the end of the fight. But the damage check, it looks absolutely insane. You're supposed to kill off this stupid water Ellie and have this controlled burn at the end of the fight where players are getting ice blocked at the same time. The amount of raid-wide damage is insane. So you're on a timer for when you need the boss to actually die.
We were faced with quite a big dilemma. Do we kill the water elemental or do we leave it up? And do we get people ice blocked intentionally to break them out, or do we just nuke the boss? These were probably the biggest choices we had to make, and ultimately what enabled us to get world first, I think, here was making the right choice. We decided to leave the water Ellie up and just have people that were debuffed with Heart of Frost move out of the raid, and we decided to just burn the boss rather than doing some sort of controlled strategy with the ice blocks.
So the best defense for something like this is obviously just kill the boss as fast as possible. And the burn strategy, like you heard Chris Potter talking about there, is the one that Method ended up opting for. And at this point in time, it's still relatively unknown if the burn strategy is even possible. So yeah, Monday morning rolls around and all of Method shows up to the raid and they're troll. And I'm not talking about their players, I'm talking about the race. They're trolls. And this, it was due to the pretty unknown racial ability, Voodoo Shuffle, which reads that it reduces the duration of all movement and parrying effects by 20%. And this ended up working on Chilling Touch. So Chilling Touch, it had a slow component to it, and by having Voodoo Shuffle, it allows you to drop stacks of the dot 2 ticks earlier. And at this moment in time, this is just classic Method. Come up with a new, innovative strategy and have some of the absolute weirdest tech ever. So with this marquee troll strategy, and the boss is already really low, Method doesn't kill the boss. And unfortunately, Monday comes and goes, and there's still no kill for Method. What is their best attempt at this point, though? It's 7%. Boss notably dies a little bit higher than normal bosses. It dies at 5.5%, which doesn't really die, but it's not really relevant. And the damage check, it just kind of seems like it's not there for Method. And we're running into the same problem that we had last year. Limit, they have a few more hours in the reset before the re-clear happens, and Limit inevitably wins off the back of 16-hour head start. And this is what I would say, except for the fact that Method woke up Tuesday morning and had an absolutely miraculous kill of Jaina Proud.
Let's fucking go! Good job, boys.
Method, like we saw earlier, they basically all end on a burn strategy with things like Battle Restoration Shaman and Double Disc Priest, and committed to try to just doing as much damage as possible to beat all of the mechanics on the fight. This is an incredibly risky strategy that could have lost them the race. However, this was the only way of actually killing the boss on week 1, and in hindsight, Limit, well, they opted actually for a safer strategy that required more HPS and less DPS. And Method, they are dominant and continuing to prove why they're just so damn good. And that's basically the end of BOD. There was a surprising lack of drama post here. Limit seemed more committed now more than ever before to continue to push forward in the Race to World First scene. And Method, well, they've won 4 races in a row, so they're really cementing like a legacy level performance here, proving that they are the best. How are the vibes coming out of Battle of Dazar'alor? Were things like really down in the dumps after 2 tiers of like, you know, not streaming, like fully committing to trying to get Race to World First? Like, how were the vibes after that tier?
Yeah, that was that was very rough. The one good thing was it kind of was like, here's a bunch of things we know we can improve on. Because like same with the extension, it was like, okay, never do that again. Like at least you know like how to do better. But yeah, Battle of Dazar'alor, there was some math on Jaina with what to do, how many healers to use, where to use the lust and stuff like that. So at least like we had something to work off of. But I remember it being pretty rough because I mean every one of these tiers, it's like this is the one, we're gonna do it, and then we fell flat. And I mean Eternal Palace, I think was much worse on the vibes, but maybe that was just I don't know. That at least for me, Eternal Palace is the worst one, but Battle of Dazar'alor was pretty rough because like we thought we had it. We were so far ahead, and then you know, you just hit that, I mean, the wall literally on Jaina.
BOD wraps up, and there's a mini raid that contains 2 bosses. It's not especially relevant to the story of the Race to World First, as it's 1, not an N-tier boss, and 2, Limit and Method both end up not throwing too many attempts at it in any real manner. Limit does end up doing 2 days of progression. Method did a few days worth of prog in total. This raid ends up overlapping with the MDI, and many players from both Limit and Method are competing in said MDI. And so the end boss of Crucible of Storms, it's Uunat. This ends up actually being one of the hardest end bosses of all time. It ends up eclipsing 700 attempts prior to the first kill. And most of the time I probably would have ignored this, but there's some context that's actually relevant with this raid that sets us up for future tiers. Method ends up killing the boss world 2nd. Limit ends up killing it like world 25th, so weeks later. And this may lead you to wonder, who killed this boss world 1st? And so that is where the next contender, Pieces, shows up. Where Pieces, this is a brand new guild that is brand new to the Race World First scene. They're previously an evening raiding team that normally raids 5 to 6 hours a night, 7 days a week. They've decided to actually participate in the Race World First in both Crucible of Storms and moving on into the future. And downing Uunat, this is actually a really powerful first statement for them. Taking 730 attempts for an end boss, that's no small feat. That's largely regarded as one of the hardest end bosses of all time. I think that goes down in history as the most attempts that have ever been taken on a boss. Unfortunately for them, Crucible Storm's not really seen as a real world first due to it not being the end boss of a tier. However, everybody's kind of on alert that Pieces could be a real contender moving into Ashara's Eternal Palace, making this a 3-horse race. Now here comes the drama. It's not really relevant to the story of the Race to World First, but it's still pretty funny drama. So previously, Method had actually been doing their Race World First events in the Red Bull Gaming Sphere in London, UK. Red Bull was giving them the venue, running the production for the event as what I would describe as a production partner for Method. So Red Bull, they decide that they want the Race World First product larger and under one umbrella. This makes sense. Basically, what the pitch was is that they wanted to migrate the Method stream onto the Red Bull Gaming stream, pick up additional guilds to make the World First race a cumulative product. Basically putting all of the guilds that would participate in the Race World First on one channel. They also wanted to get all guilds involved in one singular location. This sounds really cool, right? However, Method, they don't really want this. They continue to want ownership of their product. This is just standard business stuff that normally people don't hear about. So Red Bull and Method, they're parting ways. Not really dramatic, right? This is until Sko just slams down a twitlonger, airs all of this out, tries to pin the blame solely on Red Bull. He ends up stating that a third-party corporations try to steal away the community event from the community. The irony is not lost here. And then he announced that Pieces and Limit are going to be streaming the Race World First at the Red Bull Gaming Sphere. For obvious reasons, leaking your competition's event and, claiming that an evil corporation's trying to take your event from you is a little bit weird. Unfortunately, Red Bull ends up never working in WoW again after Eternal Palace for obvious reasons, and nobody's really happy about this entire situation. But good news, there's a 3-horse race. We're also blessed by some equally as exciting news. We're going to be able to see both Pieces and Limit raid on broadcast for the first time at the Red Bull Gaming Sphere. And Method, well, they found a new venue in Krefeld, Germany, so everybody's got a broadcast. All right, drama's out of the way. We set the stage. Now, Ashara's Eternal Palace. This raid comes out, and the raid kind of goes pretty much as expected. That is, however, until Limit encounters the buzzsaw that is probably the most difficult 4th boss in history, Lady Ashfane. So she ended up requiring a stupid amount of healing if the strategy of the boss was done the intended way. Guilds eventually opted to 3-tank this boss and more or less ease the most difficult part of the fight and turning it into mostly a damage check instead of a staunch heal check. And now Limit, they end up killing it, but it's not until their 2nd day. And Method, they on the other hand, end up downing Lady Ashfane world first in 35 attempts after seeing Limit swap to a 3-tanking strategy late into their first day. And this is actually the earliest I've ever actually seen a European guild get a world first. And something that I end up mentioning earlier, and that's a common trope that we're going to have to keep watching out for into the future, is that if Method ever ends up killing a boss ahead of Limit, they win the Race to World First outright. Is that going to stay true on something like a 4th boss with pretty minimal stakes? I guess we're going to have to see. Now, with these minimal stakes here, Limit, they come back and they end up downing the 5th boss of the raid, Orgazoa world first. Method fires back, gets Queen's Court world first. And this kind of sets us up where the penultimate encounter of the raids here, Zakul, is standing in front of both Method and Limit. And Zakul, this is kind of an encounter that relies on a couple individuals to do 90% of the work on the fight. 2 sets of 3 players end up going down into a phase called the Delirium Realm. They need to kill ads in time. There's also an upstairs phase, and they have to kill an ad in time as well. There's core people doing very specific jobs and a majority of the work on this fight. And the tank is probably the other most important person there, where tentacles are constantly slamming down alongside over the course of the entire room, where it's cutting off and denying space rather quickly. So the tank positioning the boss effectively is a huge deal. And so having a tank who could quickly assess and determine where the safe spots in the room are was integral to being able to progress this encounter at all. And so Limit, they actually end up going on to pioneer this strategy that every guild ends up using for the rest of time on this fight, where they relied on one tanking this encounter with a Brewmaster Monk. And so there's a tank mechanic on this fight that involves the two tanks being tethered together. And apparently, if you just didn't have a second tank, it would go on the nearest DPS. And Limit discovered that they could just put that on their Havoc Demon Hunter. Their Havoc Demon Hunter can leech through all the damage that they're taking from this tether. This allows the DPS checks on this fight that were so hard earlier with the Delirium Realm and the upstairs phase to be met a lot easier than otherwise anticipated. And Limit, honestly, they were just far more consistent on their Delirium Realms. Method ends up struggling a ton, getting their players to be able to kill the ads downstairs without dying. So, we had never actually seen this before. What was it like to take a step out of the raid and have been one tanking Zakul and you pivoting to that outside the raid leader role?
I haven't been asked a question like this in such a long time. Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, the way we were doing it is back then your raid leader had to be in the raid. It was the only thing you'd ever thought of. So we actually didn't have Ben in initially. When we started solo tanking, I think it was an hour or two before dinner, and I was doing it while raid leading, and I'm like, this is doable, this is fine. It's just I could just walk over to your computer, put on your headset, and just raid lead basically from your mic. And that's what we did. It wasn't high tech at all. He couldn't even hear his weak auras going off or anything. I was just, or comms. He had no headset on. I was just raid leading from behind his computer basically for an hour until we figured out a more elegant solution than that.
And so Limit is so far ahead going into Queen Ashara, but we see Limit ahead a lot of the time because they're, an NA guild. But how far ahead were they going into Queen Ashara? 26 hours. So a 26-hour head start going into the final boss. This should be race winning. Under almost all circumstances, this should be race winning. Until we saw what Queen Ashara was all about. And Queen Ashara, she had an intermission phase where you needed to kill 3 of Queen Ashara's minions. These ads, frankly, just had way too much HP. The phase was not completable in time. And for Limit, they were just waiting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pulls deep into the boss. There is no end in sight. This boss is actually just not killable. And whenever something like this happens, this is actually perfect for Method, who they have a 26-hour disadvantage, but the hundreds of pulls on a boss that's not killable for Limit, Method's able to completely catch back up. And both of them are walled at the same Phase 2 intermission. So the guilds, they're kind of sitting there, they're in limbo, and then it happens. The boss is hotfixed. Arcane Vulnerability, which is the main damage source on the encounter, gets nerfed, but the most notable nerf to the encounter was the intermission that had this impossible DPS check. It went from a 2-minute enrage to a 3-minute enrage, and that meant the DPS check was now doable from something that was previously impossible. And Method and Limit, they end up busting through the P2 wall that had walled everybody off fairly quickly. After these hotfixes happened, Method ended up playing a better composition throughout the entirety of progression, and they win the race to world first again off of the back of, many people would say, pretty poorly timed nerfs. The compositional difference is basically Method was 2 healing with double Disc Priest. They ended up having Merez on a Moonkin. He was slamming off heals whenever that was required. And this meant that any other DPS check that was associated with the fight was completely irrelevant. And so coming out of the raid, a lot of the storylines surrounding this raid were about a couple of things. One, Method goated. Downing Queen Ashara in 350 pulls to Limit 550 pulls is downright impressive. Every tier, it feels like Method and Limit are very close, but somehow Method ends up pulling a rabbit out of the hat any point at any time it's necessary. And the other storyline, it involves Limit. Limit really kind of did get robbed here. They get robbed for a chance at the race world first due to an impossible boss and shitty hotfix timings. If these hotfix timings weren't preferred for Method, we probably have a different story where the Limit's killing the boss ahead and Method's, complaining about hotfix timings at the same time. Limit did get screwed here. There's also a narrative at this time about Limit choking, and this is a hard narrative to ignore since they were ahead on 3 bosses going into the final boss, and then they lose. And the common kind of sentiment is maybe Method winning these race to world first is something that's going to be inevitable. So storyline-wise, we're going into the final raid of Battle for Azeroth. Method, they're basically looking for a sweep. Limit had been on the cusp of winning World First, but Method has just figured it out every single time whenever they needed to. In the final tier of the expansion, this was Method's to lose. Limit also at the time has been making some pretty big moves. They end up inking a deal with Complexity, turning them into Complexity Limit. They also end up committing to streaming pretty much every POV with almost all of their players in person at the GameStop Performance Center, home of Complexity. At the same time, they also end up picking up 2 outside the raid, quotation marks, helpers in the form of Weakora's Guru Relo and DBM's Mystical OS. And there's also a brand new system for this patch, Corruption. Corruption basically made characters very, very overpowered, and Corruption could actually be as high as 20% of your damage, and for the Race World First guilds, Echoing Void, I remember that one was super broken. Corruption in general was just turbo OP. I remember at the time as well, Nagi ended up putting on a piece of cloth pants, breaking his armor mastery bonus in order to be able to wear more Corruption. Just absolutely ridiculous. But how does the Corruption equate to the Race World First? Well, the drops in Corruption pieces, they were RNG, kinda. BOEs could actually, at the time, contain Corruption, meaning you had Race World First guilds shelling out hundreds of millions of gold in order to outfit their entire team with Corruption. And this is where the gold arms race really begins, where there was basically no amount of gold that could be offered up to these guilds that they would decline if it meant that they had an advantage in the Race World First. You would spend 100 million gold if you had to. We are gone from the days where swapping factions is taboo. We are emptying the bank. And so now moving on to the raid itself, Ny'alotha is a 12-boss instance, and this is one of the largest raids in history. And everybody's kind of expecting a multi-week affair, as you do with 12-boss instances. In the race, it kicks off fairly standard. First few bosses go down easily. There's only a couple of bosses that end up being Race World First relevant. First is the 7th boss of the raid, Ra-Din. Ra-Din was fairly controversial by the community, but not really to Race World First guilds. He basically had a fairly quick respawn rate, which allowed guilds to do some, I would describe them as creative strategies with things like Havoc Demon Hunter's Metamorphosis and Destro Warlock's Grimoire of Supremacy. Basically, players were stacking buffs over and over again because Ra-Din ended up respawning every 20 seconds. This allowed things like Havoc Demon Hunter to have 20 more seconds of demon form up time. Warlocks ended up having 160% damage amp during their first Infernals for destruction. Blizzard goes through and eventually fixes this on the reset by having Ra-Din respawn 20 seconds later, but it was an integral strategy in both Limit and Method killing Ra-Din, where some people called for the banning of the guilds for this. It's kind of laughable, really. These weren't really that big of exploits in the grand scheme of things. Both guilds end up taking down Ra-Din in around 80 pulls, and, this is a fairly tough encounter. Even with it being a pretty tough encounter, both Method and Limit roughly kill it at the same time during their second day of raiding, meaning that NA still had the 16-hour advantage. The only other pretty early Race World First relevant boss was the 8th boss in Drestagath. This is an encounter where you just kill ads over and over again. Limit ends up making it to Drestagath first. They end up killing the boss in 15 pulls, aka this took them 2 hours. Method, on the other hand, ended up taking 50 attempts. And when asked about this post-race, Max from Limit basically said, I don't know, we just yelled at the boss. On a boss that Method literally lost 6 hours to on the encounter compared to Limit, and Limit YOLO'd the boss. Impressive. Something else has kind of been happening during this race. The longtime raid leader for Limit, Maximum, he has not been in the race almost at all. He was in on Drestagath as a tank. Otherwise, he's been sitting. Originally, the statement from the crew was that Now was tanking in order to just get gear as a tank, and tank gear at this point in time is much less relevant than DPS gear, especially with how personal loot worked. However, at some point, everybody just kind of realized Max was going to be 21st manning the entire raid, and this was Limit's trump card. This is a huge deal for the future of the Race World First, as bringing your raid leader outside the raid is a massive advantage. Most teams hadn't done this up until this point, as it's just frankly less fun. At the same time, all the Race World First teams are really pushing the envelope here, and getting World First is the only thing that matters.
And yeah, I don't know. We did it there. Unza and then obviously in Ny'alotha, we went into the tier. We actually had tried to do it previously. We recruited a bunch of tanks. We tried to have Trill Tank. We recruited 2 trial tanks, all with the intention of, let me do this outside the raid thing. But every time the tanking situation just didn't work, and the feedback from the guild was like, this isn't like, we're going to be worse if we do this, basically, because the tanking options weren't great. And then when we recruited Now, it just made sense, and it was It was like, okay, we finally have someone where this makes sense. Let's send it. And then a Ny'alotha obviously was super OP, and then everyone's doing it now.
So we're chugging along. Limit and Method both make it to the penultimate encounter in Carapace of N'Zoth. Limit has quietly just been playing straight up better than Method. There's no Lady Ashvane hiccups or anything like that. And then something unexpected happens. Limit kills the Carapace of N'Zoth 24 hours ahead of Method. This is the exact same situation that happened with Zakul in the previous tier. And I said it in the previous section, but a 24-hour head start going into the final boss should be unlosable. Again, should be unlosable. However, will Method be able to pull magic out of the hat twice? That's kind of the question that's looming on everybody's mind. Method seems to be able to make magic out of absolutely nothing time and time again, and Method were the undeniable favorites coming into this tier. N'Zoth, well, he's hard. He's not Queen Ashara pre-nerf hard, but he's really tough. There's also a secret phase, allegedly. And the core of the N'Zoth encounter revolves around the sanity mechanic, where if you get too low on sanity, you get mind controlled. That's roughly the core of the fight. There are ads that try to drain your sanity, and you have an extra action button that lets you replenish your sanity, but there's a finite amount of uses of this, and that's what happens, and then we get to the secret phase. How did you feel about the secret phase on N'Zoth? Obviously, the casters were kind of cooking up, maybe Magni and Mother shoot this cannon, and the boss starts taking bonus damage. As somebody who was playing it, you guys get to the boss, or get to the secret phase, the boss is 70% HP, and you come out of the secret phase and it's, I guess, kind of nothing. What were kind of the vibes like for you guys with that one?
Well, part of it was like, I think everybody until the boss died was like, is there actually more? And coming out of Eternal Palace with like, I know we had such a lead there and then fumbled it. It was like, okay, the boss has to have something else. Or like, what is the thing that's going to hardwall us? Are we hardwalled right now and they're going to need to nerf the boss? Are we losing progress? It's kind of like this weird, like, there's got to be more to this boss. What is going to catch us off guard that's going to let the other guild like kind of leapfrog ahead? But luckily the boss was weird and kind of just incremental progress got it down. But yeah, that secret phase was kind of meh. But I mean, when you win, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it was like, okay, cool, good boss, good raid, GG.
I mean, this is my first race casting it, so I was still excited to see like everything was going to happen. I think it was the same as like Heroic. You went down and they were just like the orbs you had to soak, and you just killed the dude and went upstairs and left it, and the boss died eventually, right? Like,
yeah.
There wasn't a whole lot to it, I don't think.
Yeah,
so it's Heroic, right?
The speculation was that it was like supposed to be like a secret mythic phase, and it was just a whole lot of nothing. So the community, they think the secret phase is going to be epic, but it's kind of a nothing burger. Limit makes it there first, but the boss is high, like 75% high. And as you heard from Kalamazi and Cams, we didn't even think the boss was remotely killable, or we thought that the boss had to have a damage amp or something. But as it turns out, the plan was to just kind of kill the boss from that health threshold. First time the Enrage was seen by Limit. How healthy was the boss, though, on the Enrage? 40%. This was going to be basically a massive grind. There were murmurs about the boss potentially needing an HP nerf, but if you're a Racer World First guild, you can't really focus on these things. You really only try to control what you can control. Unfortunately, for the casters, there was no secret Magni damage amp phase, even though we were cooking on one hard. And so then Limit got to work. Chipping away at the HP on the boss, they hit the Enrage at 35%. Then they hit their Enrage at 25%. 15%. Then everybody begins to recognize that the boss is actually killable. Then Limit does the impossible. They have a 5% wipe. The boss, it dies at 2.2%. So Limit, they've taken the boss from an Enrage at 40% HP, where nobody thought the boss was killable, all the way down to 5%. And then they really do the impossible. They actually killed the boss, bringing home the first NA World First since Heart of Fear.
3, 2, 1.
And you may notice that I've only talked about N'Zoth from the lens of Limit, and that might ask, where's Method? Well, Method, they've actually had a horrible tier in Ny'alotha. They end up not killing N'Zoth until 2 days after Limit, which is a completely uncharacteristic fumble by this squad, and they had some pretty bad play by them in total. And as a guild that was trying to sweep the entire expansion, This was pretty surprising from Method, and it was really surprising to see Limit look so dominant where the tier, it wasn't even particularly close. And now we end BFA and things feel great. The races started out of nowhere. We have 2 regional contenders, competition's fierce, and the landscape of the Race to World First is growing ever more competitive. This is a very, very bright future for the Race to World First. Okay, so now I gotta talk about a part of the video that honestly I didn't really want to talk about too much. During the period between Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands, a troubling situation had emerged outside of the realm of the Race to World First. But at the same time, it pretty much deserves acknowledgement due to how it changes the story. There were serious allegations of sexual misconduct that were levied against a key figure in Method. Evidence of this indicated that the organization's leadership and their ownership, not necessarily the raiding team itself, had been aware of multiple prior complaints, but they failed to intervene. The person in question had faced a Twitch ban multiple months prior due to similar concerns. This ends up highlighting a pattern that was not addressed by upper management from Method. In fact, it was actually shown that Method was actually trying to help this person instead of the victims. And now the members of the Method raid team, they felt like Method leadership had acted inappropriate at this time, and they decided to break off from Method in order to form their own guild. That is how Echo is formed, and, you know, fortunately enough, we don't really ever have to discuss Method again. With all that turmoil in the landscape of the Race to World First scene, everybody is kind of preparing for a limit sweep of the Shadowlands expansion. That's kind of what's to be expected, right? The fragments of Method ended up forming Echo, and they look like they're probably going to be behind in Castle Nathria progression. Method ends up trying to revive as a new guild, but they're nowhere near as good on a roster level as the previous Method. Maybe pieces can kind of step up similar to where they were in BFA. BDG is an NA guild, and you know they're starting to compete for the Race to World First. Maybe NA can have the top 2 spots. Also, at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic is also in full swing at this moment in time, and people are still in lockdown at their homes. This creates this weird dynamic where the Race to World First broadcast and productions are all going to be remote. Maybe this ends up being a new era for the productions themselves. Everything was kind of in turmoil, but one thing was pretty consistent. Everybody expected Limit to be super dominant. And another thing is certain here, this is actually the largest amount of contenders that we will ever have for the Race to World First at the same time. Everybody really was expecting a dominant Limit victory. Again, talking about the 21st manning of the raid. At this point, moving forward, every guild's going to be 21st manning. They're all going to have outside raid leading and add-on help. That stuff, you know, from one tier to a next, those were some of the biggest pickups and biggest changes on a structural level. Moving into the raid kicks off, and we have more or less the same stuff happening. The first few bosses in Shriekwing, Huntsman Altamore, Hungering Destroyer, these first couple of bosses, they're essentially one-shots. Then we end up at the decision point of Lady Nerva Dark Vein, Artificer's Eye Mox, and Sun King Salvation. You know, most guilds end up going to Sun King Salvation. At the same time, these are not especially hard bosses. So all these bosses, they end up dying day 1, sub 45 cumulative pulls. This is all very typical for the Race to World First. Kill as many bosses as you can on day 1 of Mythic. So Limit that kills Zymox, like I said earlier, but it was pretty late in the day. They decide to pull a boss, Council of Blood, a couple times off stream to see timings and mechanics, and to test a couple of different kill orders of bosses. But the boss died after 13 attempts off stream. Now, the kill of this fight is locally recorded, but this is definitely the first time where we ever experience a Race to World First guild, quote-unquote, going dark. This unfortunately would not be the last, where going dark is essentially where a team decides that is the most definitely in a massive advantage to pull a boss off stream, where otherwise you would be getting a massive disadvantage if you were to pull it on stream. This tends to be reserved for end bosses, or you reach a boss at the very end of your raid day, you pull it 2 times, you turn your stream off, and you go to bed. On top of that as well, it could potentially be to not give up any strategies, weak auras, add-ons, or similar things. And it's something that ends up becoming increasingly common as of late, as you'll see being discussed in future tiers as well. But the reason it was notable here was, first off, this was basically the first time this ends up ever happening, and the viewers were not happy. Some would even claim that it was a fake Race to World First due to this. This ends up being pretty funny considering where we are now, but I remember viewers at the time as well calling for sponsors to drop the organization and whatnot. But viewers and being clueless, name a more iconic duo. But yeah, Limit kind of weirdly killed Council of Blood off stream, which is really, really strange. And the European contenders, they actually end up starting their raid day, and it's pretty apparent that Echo, this is a very real team. Method and Pieces look pretty much like they'll be battling with BDG for 3rd through 5th. We're back to a situation where it's a 2-horse race. And we get to the meat of the race. Sludge Fist, Stone Legion Generals, and Sire Denathrius, all 3 very brutal encounters. Sludge Fist, this is widely regarded as the best patchwork fight of all time, with incredible damage amps, insane healing checks, and just an absolute tightest DPS check of a modern Race World First boss. Race World First kills, they end up killing this boss 10 seconds post-enrage, and the boss is like crashing into the wall, all the rubble is crumbling down. Limit ends up killing it first, around 15 hours ahead of Echo. However, what happens next ends up halting progression. Tell me about your favorite boss of all time, Stone Legion Generals, and what made that boss just so epic for the Race World First?
For the Race World First? Okay, in the Race World First, Stone Legion Generals, it was really cool because there was so much exciting different things that could happen. Like, the boss's abilities could cast in a different order, and that would really change how you had to play the fight. That was actually kind of cool for the Race World First because it required a degree of adaptation, but it also, some combinations were a lot harder than others. There were also a lot of exciting, I don't want to call them bugs, but little mini features that fight had. For instance, you had this part of the fight where General Draven was fighting these enemies up in the air, and he would hit them down to like 30%, and then they would drop down, and you would try and kill them, and you try and kill them all around the same time. But he could miss them, and they would just stay up in the air for way longer. And he could also crit them, and they would drop with like way less health. So that was really fun. The intermission also, you would have a Voidwalker tank some of the tank hits that General Call would do when she was down, because it was too brutal for your tank to actually live that. So you'd have to be far enough away that the Voidwalker was the only target, because she would target like any player within 30 yards over the Voidwalker in melee. So you would bring the boss all the way over to Narnia, and then you would like double leap away, and the Voidwalker would still be there. And your Warlock would get to do this really fun gameplay where they would be resummoning their Voidwalker, and then they would be doing a curse rotation as well. So of every 60 seconds, like 10 of their globals would be summoning pets and casting curses, which they really enjoyed. Yeah, and then also you would have your priest. You'd use all your reses. I guess you'd also use Ankh Totem on your priest, mass dispelling, and just getting themselves killed, because there was this debuff that was like a moderately dangerous dot for 30 seconds, and then when you dispelled it, both the person who got dispelled and the person doing the dispelling got a nasty dot for 6 seconds, but you could just MD it, and then just the priest would die, and you'd basically delete all of the extra dots, and then you'd have them angel form and take the angel form res thing, or the Ankh Totem. So that was pretty fun as well. And you also just get to go healing immune every time you put the any of the gargoyles below 30% health. And the best part was, Phase 1 was like one general plus gargoyles.
Yeah.
Phase 2 was the other general plus gargoyles. And then Phase 3 was just both generals. But that was way easier than either Phase 1 or Phase 2, because gargoyles were more difficult to deal with than either of the actual bosses. So once you got to Phase 3, you got there a couple of times and the boss just died, which was really fun and satisfying to kill.
Worst fight of all time?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, not close.
But both guilds, they end up being stuck on Stone Legion Generals for multiple days, pull wiping bugs, DPS check, spell queuing, and just needing to work through every possible overlap. That proved to be a very difficult challenge, as historically, this is where Method won many of their Race to World firsts, whenever the going got tough and progression started to halt for the NA contenders. On a boss that feels impossible to kill, this is where that 16-hour advantage completely gets erased, and you can just begin to outstrat the other team. And kind of an insane comp stack was required for this boss, where you ended up having like 3 to 4 Night Fae Hunters in order to be able to kill the adds during the intermission. And this is widely regarded as one of the worst bosses of all time due to difficulty, bugs, and comp stacking that was required. And both Echo and Limit end up killing this boss a day before their reset. So Limit ends up killing it on Monday, Echo ends up killing it on Tuesday.
Make sure they go even, and we have to get one more eruption soak. One more
Let's
eruption
fucking
soak.
go. Let's
One
fucking
more
go.
eruption
Come
soak.
on!
Limit ends up pulling Denathrius for a few hours on stream and goes to do some chores and pieces out until the Tuesday reset. Echo ends up killing Stone Legion generals a bit earlier in their raid day, so a bit faster than it took Limit, but it still wasn't enough to be fully catched up on that 16-hour disadvantage. They had ended up cutting their 15-hour Sludge Fist split down to 9 hours, but we're on to the final boss. This is where you can actually end up making up the most time. I also forgot to mention this at the time, but this is like the 21st of December. People are less than thrilled about the idea of the Race World First overlapping with Christmas. However, this is the most important week of the year for a lot of these competitors. Christmas, it can wait. What was it like, the decision to go dark on Sire Denathrius? You know, not many guilds had ever raided off stream before. Obviously, Limit at the time ended up killing Council of Blood off stream, which was a little bit controversial. But then you guys pushed the envelope and decided to not stream the first beginning progression of Sire Denathrius. What was that decision like?
I don't remember 100% if what I'm about to say is accurate. It was already like a little bit later in the day when we killed Stone Legion. The idea was that, hey, you know, because we're gonna go to bed, we don't want to give too much information out. So, especially because phase 1 generally was pretty easy to get through, right? Like one way or another, you could make it to phase 2. Try to get some info, cook overnight for phase 2, but try not to give that out. It was a little bit uncharted territory, I must say as well. It's been so long, so I don't remember the exact thought process, but it was more like maybe it was a reaction to the Council of Blood situation. I would say that's when we started thinking a lot about, you know, like we have like a real competitor, because in Ny'alotha we got a little bit stomped back when, you know, Method was a thing, right? But yeah, coming out of a loss, also recently forming Echo, it was a lot of stuff going on in our mind. So I don't know, it was not like super, like it was not super planned, I would say. It was more like, oh great, we got Stone Legion generals, then we go to Sire Denathrius and we were like, okay, we don't want to give too much to, you know, give away too much of our advantage here. Yeah, that was it. Now, having said that, okay, we failed at doing this. I don't know if you remember, because we said, okay guys, we'll just play phase 1, and if we manage to reach phase 2, like as we're falling down, just turn off the stream, like turn it to black or something, right? And we thought actually it's gonna be a little bit funny as well, right? Like for the audience, like little did we know people would be up in arms about it.
People were not happy,
but,
yeah.
Yeah, but one of our players did not manage this. So we actually ended up streaming phase 2.
It really is a pretty significant competitive disadvantage to show some stuff on stream, especially that relating towards the end boss. At the same time, fans are also rightly upset. This is just the natural order of how the Race to World First works. Good news, Denathrius doesn't die off stream. Reset happens, both guilds re-clear, no Gahoon incidents. However, when Limit and Echo make it back to Denathrius, something interesting happens. Echo turns back on competition mode on Warcraft logs, and they have previously had a 25.9% wipe prior to the reset. Earlier, I cited that Limit's best pull was around 50%, so that going dark sentiment, it was actually heavily rewarded, immediately rewarded. On top of all of this as well, there's also a secret mythic phase that pretty much everyone had known about. Echo's P2 Denathrius strategy ends up being a bit better than where Limits are. Every other guild in the world ends up copying the Echo P2 strategy. And this is set up in a way where Echo should win the Race to World First. As a brand new organization coming on the Race to World First scene, winning would be unbelievable. So I say should win. Unfortunately, though, Echo actually ends up having an insanely bad time on their Mythic Reclear, while Limits was, I would say, fairly effortless. This includes a one-shot of Stone Legion Generals by Limit. This is a huge deal, as the additional reset worth of gear for both sides is going to be make or break on an end boss like Sire Denathrius that we see Echo already has it at sub 50%. And so the time that it ends up taking these guilds to re-clear, this ends up being around 2.5 hours for Limit and over 6 for Echo. Not a great feeling. And now Echo, they were still doing heroic splits, and Limit is pulling Sire Denathrius with that 16-hour head start, with the few additional hours that they gained from being able to do their re-clear faster. They've already finished all of their chores, and Echo believes that they want a little bit more gear for the end of Denathrius. However, Limit catapults themselves into the lead and makes it into P3 on Denathrius, basically just busting down that wall. And they forced Echo, I guess is the best way of describing it, to call splits quits early, prior to where they wanted to, and then immediately start pulling Denathrius. This put us in a great situation where both Limit and Echo are simultaneously pulling a sub 30% in boss and progging the final phase together. And even though Echo was really far ahead coming out of the reset, the superior play from Limit on the end points of Denathrius, this proved to be instrumental, ends up allowing them to take down Denathrius World first, giving in a back-to-back champion, and Christmas was saved.
Wait, chill.
Fucking go!
Come on.
Yes, let's.
And narratively, Echo looked really good. Even though everybody kind of expected Limit to sweep, Echo actually proved that they didn't need Method. Method needed them. And with a few improvements, everybody kind of expected that we could see Echo winning Race World Firsts again soon. At the same time, Limit does feel like they're a little bit ahead. If they continue to put their foot on the gas, it's going to be tough for Echo to be able to come back from this. In the wake of Limit's victory over Echo, and Echo honestly having a pretty positive showing in Castle Nathria, the next raid that we have in front of us is the Sanctum of Domination. With this as well, we also have the COVID-19 pandemic. It's still raging at this point, and with most of the world sitting inside, the number of eyes on the Race World First has never been higher. However, unlike Castle Nathria, this raid is not viewed as favorably as Nathria was. This was due to a couple reasons, but probably the most relevant one towards the Race World First is the Shards of Domination system, where this was supposed to work like tier sets, and they were RNG drops from the raid. The shards themselves, they were gems that you put on gear that you obtained from the raid, but the shards had only a chance to drop once per boss, regardless of difficulty, or from the world boss outside the raid, and the gear that you would end up putting it on, obviously there was only specific slots that you could put these Shards of Domination in. And for the Race to Roll First, this is an even bigger emphasis on doing normal and heroic splits. And the difference in splits, it was pretty massive, where between the two main contenders in Limit and Echo ends up doing a lot more splits, and they have a 1 item level advantage throughout the entirety of the Sanctum of Domination Race to World First. So that is some context, just from the Race to World First perspective. This tier wasn't viewed super fondly for other reasons, but that's probably the most Race to World First relevant thing that you need to know. Raid opens, Limit and BDGG start their days doing chores like Korthia farming, Torghast, splits. You kind of get the gist of like what's going to be going on. You got to do a bunch of chores. First guild inside the raid is Imperative. They had partnered with esports org Sonics before this race, also hoping to join in on competing for the Race to World First. We're probably never going to mention them again, but they ended up securing World First on 3 bosses, and then before Limit wakes up, gets World Second on the 9, overtaking Imperative. Then they get the World First on Remnant of Ner'zhul, the 4th boss in the raid. BDGG was looking pretty promising on the first day, taking down the first 3 bosses at quick pace, and even spending less pulls on the second boss, Eye of the Jailer, than Limit did. However, after killing the 3rd boss, BDG decided to go to Soul Render instead of towards Remnant of Ner'zhul. And for BDG, this was pretty costly. Limit goes for Remnant of Ner'zhul. They kill it in a couple hours, like I said, before moving on to Soul Render. But Soul Render, that was a pretty massive step up in difficulty. BDGG eventually has to backtrack, goes and kills Remnant of Ner'zhul, then comes back to Soul Render Dormazane, and everybody's kind of locked on that boss. Limit takes some time, and after some 20-odd pulls, Soul Render was getting as low as 20%. They actually decide to pause their mythic progress, figuring that this boss could not be killed without snagging some gear upgrades, and instead, they go and opt to do heroic and normal splits. Yes, I said normal splits. Again, like we were talking about earlier with Shards of Domination, splits were very important this tier in order to be able to get the unique armor pieces in your Domination shards and those Domination shard slots. And with a few hours of splits, Blizzard decides that Soul Render's Dormazane may be a little bit too hard. They end up nerfing it down a little bit and greatly reducing the damage it dealt on Mythic difficulty. And after hearing this, Limit walks back into Raid, downs Soul Render Dormazane in 3 pulls. They get the World First on that, and then they're on to the 5th boss of the Raid. Limit immediately turn off their streams for after Soul Render, and it's the end of their raid day. They don't want to reveal any strategies for what's inevitably going to be the first roadblock of the raid, Painsmith Raznal. Echo, on the other hand, after EU reset happens, they wake up, they do a little bit of chores, they step foot in the raid as early as possible. It still does take them a solid 8 hours to catch up to Limit at the 5 out of 10 bosses mark due to the chores that you have to do with things like Torghast and Splits and whatever else that you have to do to be able to participate in the race to world first. The other participating European guilds in Method and Pieces, they only end up making it to 4 out of 10 on their first day, while American guilds BDGG and Instant Dollars joined in at the 5 out of 10 mark with only an hour left in the day. So we're actually seeing competition that is relatively close, more so than ever before, realistically, but at the same time, it still feels like there's a two-horse race only between both Limit and Echo. And after catching up to Limit and reaching the 6th boss, the first real wall of the race presented itself in Painsmith Raznal. Basically, this is an all-time very cool boss fight. If you talk to a bunch of people from this era, they might cite this as one of their favorite bosses of all time. Everyone is standing on a platform suspended in the air over a pool of lava. It's held up by 4 chains, 1 in each corner. The boss had seen some tuning changes during the day before guilds even made it there, but none of those hotfixes end up really affecting the race. So, what's the deal with this boss? Why is it an all-time wall? Well, as the second day comes to a close, the current standings see Echo with a slight lead with less pulls as they go to sleep on Painsmith, reaching 38.5% on that boss after only 48 pulls. Now, the important part about Painsmith is at the 40% mark, since that is around the time that you were making it to the second intermission. During the intermission, several spike balls come hurtling towards you, where you have to find gaps in between them while trying to dodge fire on the ground. In some of these sets, the spiked balls don't even have a gap to go through, so players need to find increasingly clever solutions to be able to clear this gap. Things like Venthyr Door of Shadows, Night Phase Soul Shape, Demon Hunters could glide and backflip, Goblin rocket jump. I remember most of Limit's guild at this time as well, they ended up changing Goblin for this boss to be able to jump off the platform and then rocket jump back onto it. Just an absolutely terrible strategy if you were a poor Disc Priest on this fight. And the very last set of spiked balls, the entire raid takes the Demonic Gateway to be able to clear it, to drop a cluster of ads that need to be killed within 12 seconds, else it is a wipe. All this is just to say it's a bunch of mumbo jumbo to say the fight's really hard. And realistically as well, Painsmith, it is a boss that is phased based on percentages, and the need for immediate damage in each intermission, this naturally leads players towards wanting to stop DPS on the boss during the end of each phase in order for him to be able to phase at the correct timer based on both healing and offensive cooldowns. For offensive CDs, this was usually dictated around the balanced Druid cooldowns, as those were some of the best in the game. However, there's also a difference between guilds here, where Echo, they end up having their Moonkins playing the Night Fae Covenant, where Limits end up going for the Venthyr Covenant, meaning that the Moonkin CDs for Echo, they can do whatever they want. And Balanced Druid, well, it was definitely the stack in this raid, where Echo ended up playing 4 of them, and Limit ended up playing 3 of them. It was just OP. And so to recap, at the end of the second day, both of the highest guilds were pretty deep into progression on Painsmith, where Limit, they end up ending their day around the 20% marker. So the third day, that starts for Echo, and they have the knowledge from Limit's struggles on Painsmith the day before, and everyone is thinking that Echo are going to jump into heroic splits to eke out some more power to help them kill the boss. However, this immediately did not happen. Echo just opts to do a few normal splits instead for some socketed gear before going straight back into Mythic. Now, this turns out to be a really good decision, as they would end up taking some pretty advantageous turns during their day. And even though it ends up taking almost their entire day, Echo eventually kills Painsmith, securing their first world first for the race and moving into the lead. And fresh off a kill on Painsmith, Echo decides to go to Guardian of the First Ones. Now, this boss was expected to be an all-time banger like Sludge Fist. Especially after seeing Painsmith Raznal, I remember the casters, we thought this was going to be Sludge Fist 2. It's in a later part of the raid, it's a single target boss with a relatively simple mechanics check. If this fight has some tight tuning, it could end up to be another wall. Unfortunately, well, that didn't happen. Guardian of the First Ones is more like a loot pinata than a real boss. In 24 pulls in over 2.5 hours, that's all it took for Echo to be able to down this fight. And Echo, they're starting to take a pretty commanding lead. Meanwhile, over on NA, Limit, they start their day by diving into heroic splits, and they don't finish their splits until after Echo had gone to bed. Once Limit has finished their splits, they walk in to Painsmith with a considerable 2.5 item level lead over Echo. And with this 2.5 item level lead, it was time for them to make some pretty real strides in the race. At least that was the plan. But in reality, it took Limit 6 hours and 40 additional pulls to finally kill Painsmith Raznal with that 2.5 item level advantage. Something that probably not supposed to happen. Now, at least after the horror of Painsmith, Limit could go to Guardian of the First Ones, which dies in around 17 pulls in less than 2 hours, and that kind of ends their third raid day. Both guilds are at 7 out of 10 on leaderboards. Echo has made some really big strides, bigger so than Limit, but Limit has pulled the 8th boss a few times, with Fate Scribe Rogue Hollow being pulled off stream prior to going to bed. Day 4, fairly underwhelming. Limit, they're sporting a considerable item level lead over Echo. Echo wakes up and they head immediately into heroic splits, which they've been putting off since the week started. And they continue with their heroic splits for the entire day. Limit, however, they don't really have any more heroic splits. They put their gear into drive and they keep going. Fate Scribe, this is a fight that actually not as challenging as you would expect, and Limit gets him down to around 20% a few hours into their day. And Fate Scribe, it's not really a hard wall. Limit ends up getting him down in a pull count of 53 attempts after just a couple of hours, because pull count doesn't always reflect exactly how hard a fight is. Fate Scribe was relatively easy. And Echo, they're still doing heroic splits, so the 4th day of the race was fairly uneventful, but it's seemingly now all about Limit as they approach the final 2 bosses of the raid. This is the part of the race where the viewers are at the edge of their seats waiting for any singular point of progression to be able to happen. So, we got the penultimate, we got the final boss. The penultimate boss of this raid is Dazar'alor, the very same Lich Lord that players defeated all those years prior in Naxxramas. I don't really know how many times we're going to kill this guy. Like, do we really have to kill this guy again? Well, in this fight, we actually have to kill him some more times. 4 to be exact. Yes, the answer is 4. We are killing him 4 more times. And you have to repeat the same phase of killing him over and over and over again and sending players downstairs to kill his remnant. And after securing a Fate Scribe kill and getting into the lead, Limited felt good about the time that they had left on their day, and they actually started making pretty steady progress onto KT, reaching about 44% on the boss, over 64 pulls during their day. The fight does have some pretty annoying adds with some enrages, and there's also some nasty overlaps of copies in the tank spawning around the room that has to be interrupted fairly quickly, otherwise you can start to cause a problem. But the phase is pretty much rinse and repeat, which Racer World First guilds tend to be pretty good at dealing with. So, Day 5. The race is getting exciting now. Echo swiftly kills off Fate Scribe Rogue Hollow at the beginning of their day, and they're heading on to KT. And judging by the day before, it seemed like we were going to see a lot of KT progression in the coming time. However, Echo, they had different plans. They cooked up a strategy overnight using a cheat death trinket that dropped from Fate Scribe itself, and this fight had I would describe it as unique interaction, where the copies of the tank ad, whenever they would spawn, and this is the messiest part of the fight, if the tank dies, the ads will also disappear. And since they were now all wearing cheat death trinkets, this meant that you could essentially skip the mechanic. And so you would put the cheat death trinket on things like your Havoc Demon Hunter, your Death Knights, your tanks, just anybody, and they would taunt the boss and kind of cheese these tank ads. According to players, this bug was also reported during PTR testing, but it never ended up getting fixed. Now this is a little bit unfortunate for viewers of the race, but it was really huge for Echo, as this allowed them to spring into the lead and killing Dazar'alor, the penultimate fight, in a measly 22 pulls. Echo, they're also completely done with their splits at this time, and they have amassed a considerable lead over Limit and item level, all things considered. They have a 1 item level lead like we cited earlier. And Limit, well, they end up adopting the Echo strat for this boss shortly after Echo killed it, and a little over an hour after Echo ends up killing it, Limit ends up downing the boss as well. And realistically, judging by the pull counts so far in this raid between the two guilds and their average item level, it's pretty clear at this point that Echo is the favorite to win this race. But we have a final boss ahead of us, and I mean, we've seen some stuff so far during the history of the Race to World First, and here comes the fun part. The final boss, Sylvanas Windrunner. And both guilds, they reach it about at the same time, and they start pulling almost immediately. And it doesn't really take very long for the guilds to reach Phase 2 of Sylvanas Windrunner, where you end up walking up this gauntlet to Oribos, where Sylvanas' final stand really takes place. Now, on this fight, there have actually been mutterings in the community about a secret mythic phase for a while. The Sylvanas fight on other difficulties usually ended at 50% HP. Granted, the rumors of a secret mythic phase, they kind of happen every single tier, but there was weird data mining around this time as well, where Sylvanas wouldn't trigger, or she would trigger something at 45% HP. So players were kind of wondering, like, what was this 45% trigger that was actually happening? But the guilds, they actually kind of expected that this was going to be the actual kill percent for the fight, as opposed to something like a completely secret mythic phase. And the guilds, they can't really focus on this at the same time. All they can really do is control what you can control, and they just need to continue to reach the end point of this fight, and that's the most important thing on these guilds' minds. So day 5, it concludes. KT has gone down for both guilds, and both of the guilds are reaching pretty deep into Sylvanas. We've actually seen Limit reach into the final phase, Phase 3, finishing at 70%, while Echo, unfortunately, they had not seen the final phase yet, but the moment that they woke up, this wouldn't actually last very long, as day 6 starts and Echo immediately starts gaming, reaching a 65% marker before Limit is even awake. And this is easily the best part of the race for viewers, as Limit and Echo are simultaneously pulling the end boss at the exact same time, racing side by side. This is the part of the race where pretty much everybody tunes in. You got the multi-monitor setup where you're watching both guilds, main monitor content type of beat. And it's truly a special experience if you're a fan of the Race for World First. Now for Limit, they did seem to struggle, however, and they were, kind of stuck more or less at 63% as their best pull, while Echo, they were edging ever so closely to that 50% marker, wiping on 50.6% twice. And players, the boss died at 50% on Heroic, and for a lot of people, it was still up in the air as to whether or not Sylvanas would die at 50% or not, or if you had to push the boss further. But the answer to that was something that Echo would eventually have to find out, much to their own despair. This moment of Echo players seeing the health tick below 50% and the boss not dying, and you see the life kind of drain out of their face as they realize that they got to get the boss 5% lower to 45%, spawned a ton of memes, and you watch their faces get hit by the reality check of a lifetime. Was easily the best moment from this entire race. Roger Brown's face is just unbeatable. Like, it's such a good clip. So this is where the news breaks, and as the news about the boss dying at 45% breaks to Limit, they actually immediately decide to do something a little bit bold. They go back into heroic splits to try to secure the very last amount of gear and the last amount of upgrades that were possible. There weren't really that many that could be obtained, but there were some. The Limit kind of recognizes at this point as well that gear is going to be a main limiting factor, since Echo already had more gear than them, and that fight was really hard. Echo, on the other hand, they actually take some time off to reassess, and they don't pull the boss again for a while, since they got to figure out where are we getting 5% boss HP from. This is a huge deal for them. They're just like sitting there trying to math out like what is the cleanest possible phase 3 where we're able to chunk away as much HP from the boss. And while most of the damage optimization should happen in P3, Echo ends up devising a new strategy for phase 2. A little bit of a cheese strategy, with now on a Blood Death night, solo tanking one of the sides while everybody else kills the other side of the platform in order to be able to save cooldowns for parts of the phase where you can actually damage Sylvanas Windrunner. This would end up making her significantly lower entering phase 3. Blizzard was not happy about this, and they immediately hotfixed that. You should not be doing that, although Echo probably would have killed it with the strategy rather quickly if they didn't. It was a bit more of a flash in the pan than anything weird, and the hotfix actually does not end up slowing them down tremendously, and Echo continues to dominate on their day, ending at a best pull of 46.5% into phase 3. They are 1.5% away from the finish line, and Echo call it a day on pull 155. Now for Echo, you just gotta be terrified. Calling an end of day whenever you are this close can be scary, as there's no guarantee that you're not gonna wake up and already have lost. And with Echo have gone to sleep, this is pretty much make or break for Limit. For Limit, it really seems like Echo can just like wake up and kill the boss anytime they want. 1.5%, that's just some additional crits, and that boss ends up going down. Limit did, however, actually move into the lead eventually, and once they did, it was pull after pull after pull, where you see between 175 and 185 attempts, they were making it all the way into deep P3 as often as possible, and their best attempt, what is it at? 45.4%. However, at this point in time, Limit, they were really feeling the time crunch, as they decided to not end their raid day yet, and they just had to keep on pulling the boss. And Limit, they ended up staying up so late, in fact, that Echo had time to wake up and continue to pull the boss. Talking about the decision to stay up really late and push for a kill on Sylvanas, what kind of factors in to the decision to stay up super late, especially whenever you're up against the reset versus, just going to bed and, waking up, collecting all the loot, and then being able to kill the boss with the extra reset worth of gear?
So Sylvanas was interesting. I think just in general across all bosses, it's basically never worth it to stay up 1 minute late to kill any boss that isn't the end boss, and that includes like second to last bosses. Recently you've seen guilds like stay up to kill those for like better vaults and stuff. I actually think that is still hurting you in the long run unless you kill it like right away, which that's like slippery slope, right? Oh, we'll kill it soon. An hour goes by. What do you do now, right? Kind of thing. But on Sylvanas, yeah, I mean, we basically knew they were going to kill it really early into their next raid. That whole raid, we'd made a few mistakes up until that point, and we were kind of, especially Kel'Thuzad, so we felt like kind of behind. and we knew we could kill it. So we were like, okay, let's stay up and do it because we feel like if we go to bed, they're definitely going to kill it. And part of it is we could have gone to bed, woke up as soon as the reset was there. Maybe there's no maintenance. I remember there was some maintenance. And then we could maybe sneak in a kill, open our vaults. And I think literally even after we lost, we one-shot it on the reset, if I remember correctly. So like that could have been our way to winning. But I think that wouldn't have been okay to a lot of us. Like if we won the Race to World first by getting a reset of gear and one-shotting it, and then they killed it in their first reset, we would have literally killed it first, but it wouldn't have felt like we won the Race to World first. So I think there was a lot of pushing because we knew they were definitely going to kill it in their reset. So we felt like we had to do the same, and we basically pulled the boss until we could no longer do it. We had one wipe where I feel like it validated our reason to stay up. We had our healer DC for the entire last phase when we had a 1% lower push than we ever have, and this is coming off of like 5 or 6 back-to-back seeing to the end of the fights. We were as locked in as humanly possible, and that DC would have been the kill. I'm so sure in my mind that it would have died on that pull. And then after it didn't, I feel like the entire guild felt like their entire sails were deflated, you know, like it took all the wind out of us. We were basically running on fumes at that point, but knowing that all of us this wasn't vocalized, but I feel like all of us felt like that, if we're going to kill this boss, that was going to be the kill. And then we like shamble wiped for like an hour and a half, called it, and then woke up and lost. Right. So that's how it goes.
They're not able to get over the finish line in time. You know, with the reset looming, if Echo is unable to kill the boss on reset 1, it would have been catastrophic. But unfortunately enough for them, Echo's got that fresh sleep buff. They've already seen everything that Limit has been doing up until this point, and Echo are able to take down Sylvanas, claiming that world first for them. And this is the first world first for Echo. After their split off for Method, you know, people didn't really know what we were going to expect from this brand new bootstrap up and starting org. But they are not only serious contenders, they are the real deal. And, you know, they should be favorites to win the Race to World first. Or best case scenario, they should at least be 50-50 and shown a lot of respect. So normally we don't talk about downtime between tiers, but the 9.1 downtime between Sanctum of Domination and Sepulcher, the first ones, this was a pretty turbulent time for Blizzard. They were still dealing with the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and trying to get people back in the office. They also had internal lawsuits going on at this time. And without going too much into details, the downtime between SOD and Sepulcher, the first ones, was an unprecedented 8 months, making it possibly one of the longest durations of a mid-expansion raid tier we've ever seen. Now, I wouldn't talk about this time if we didn't have something specific to say about the Race to World first. The biggest shakeup actually comes from the team Limit. They originally inked a deal with Complexity to become Complexity Limit all the way back in 2019, and they had been competing for a while. Their contract was set to expire, and they were actively looking for new representation. There was, you know, some bait tweets about who their new team was going to be, and they end up finally announcing that they are going to be partnering with Team Liquid, marking the end of the Limit branding era, as they were going to be simply renaming to Liquid. Now, we are just going to simply refer to them as Liquid for the rest of the video. God, I've been trying so hard to not call them Liquid the entire time. I hope I didn't mess it up at some point, but they were Limit, and now they're Liquid. In comes the Sepulcher of the first ones, and you better strap in as a viewer, because this is the longest and most difficult raid that we are ever going to see, and this raid was absolutely bananas. So, during PTR testing for this tier, we saw some differences between this and previous tiers, mostly related towards where PTR testing ended up working. So the testing for Sepulcher, it stopped after Anduin, which was the 8th boss of the raid of an 11-boss raid tier. This meant that the last 3 bosses would release without any public testing. The 7th boss, Elandris, this was a boss that was completely different during raid testing than what ended up being shipped for the raid. We'll see some context for that in a little bit later as to how that turned out. The raid tier also eventually came with the inclusion of double legendaries and the full return of tier sets, meaning there was a large chunk of power that would be backloaded that your character would get throughout this raid. The top 5 guilds were already aware of this during the PTR cycle, that double legendaries could release on week 5 of the patch, meaning the 3rd week of Mythic. We've never seen a raid make it to that long. You know, it's basically been since Hellfire Citadel, so, you know, pre-Race World First era, not really a thing that people were planning for, but it could happen. And, you know, maybe if the raid is tuned around it, it could be a natural way to nerf the raid. So with Liquid newly signed and the guild riding the high of new representation, a new venue to play for the Race to World First, the Raiders are ready for the final tier of Shadowlands. Will this newfound energy and passion be enough to be able to defeat the reigning champions from Europe? So the raid releases, and for Heroic Week, you could only kill bosses up to and including Anduin. So what did this mean for tier sets, as a lot of power were contained in these tier sets? This meant that the World First guilds were doing a ton of splits, trying to get as much tier as humanly possible off of all of the bosses that it was available from. Unfortunately, though, two important pieces of tier were locked behind Lords of Dread and Rygalon, meaning that you could not guarantee the 4-piece. The only thing that you could guarantee, even with the most splits possible, were 3 pieces of tier. And this created the situation where we saw full days of splits, and, you know, these full days of splits become increasingly more common as the Race to World First unfolds over the next couple of tiers. Doing splits can be tedious and repetitive, so naturally, raiders find any source of entertainment for themselves that they can possibly consume. So we had the Heroic Week, Mythic comes out, splits are being done for Lords of Dread and Rygalon, like I said. Day 2 of Mythic being released. Liquid is the first of the competing guilds to step out of splits and get some progression going. And it goes exactly how you kind of expect, especially with whatever we've seen so far from the Race to World First. Liquid kills the first 4 bosses within 4 hours of stepping into Mythic. They take some pulls on the 5th boss, Prototype Pantheon. They go back to Heroic splits, and they decide to return the day after with a little bit more gear. And in typical Race to World First fashion, the NA Guild always takes the initial lead before EU gets into gearing and they start catching up. And this raid was also no different. Liquid ends up also taking the 5th and 6th boss, Prototype Pantheon and Lahuvum, before Echo even steps foot in the raid. Echo follows suit the day after, and for Lahuvum, it was pretty clear that having a good strategy, that mattered a lot. And with all the information that they learned, Echo swooped in, took all that information, and killed all the exact same bosses that Liquid did, and, you know, it saved them a lot of troubleshooting on the fight. And this is where things actually start to fall into Echo's favor. As Liquid's waking up for their 4th day after Mythic is released, Echo has already started pulling Halandris. Let's talk about Halandris for a bit. This boss is probably the single most mechanically challenging boss that Blizzard has ever released. It ended up amassing a whopping 358 pulls before falling, which is very rare considering there's 4 bosses still left in this raid. You know, we did see something similar to like a mid-tier wall with Painsmith, but it's pretty rare. And for viewers though, you know, this was a fairly fun back and forth to witness, as there was always this tension of you could wipe at any point. It was a lot of days of progression. Echo ended up stopping their first day on 109 pulls, with their best attempt being only 50%, and Liquid eventually ended their first day of prog at 187 pulls, with a 41% best. So I think you could tell that you were just wiping on CD to bombs exploding. There was just 100 pass-fail mechanics, 1,000 pass-fail mechanics at any point here. And the days, they start to run together. They keep going down the exact same. Liquid and Echo basically just pulling Halandris, making very slow progression. Somehow they continue to keep finding more split characters to do at any point. It was very strange, and it was pretty clear at this point that it was a 2-horse race for Liquid and Echo. 358 pulls and several hotfixes later, the boss got nerfed a couple times, Liquid finally manages to secure the world first on Halandris on the 7th day of the race, with just 1 day left on the first reset. So to give some context for the length of this race, previous raid tiers, guilds were either at the last boss at the time of the reset, or the boss was already dead. At minimum, you were at the penultimate fight. But Sepulcher, the first ones, was now nearing the end of the first reset, and there's 4 bosses still left standing, including the final boss in the Jailer. By all intents and purposes, this raid is already shaping up to be more of a marathon than a sprint. And then as the NA reset happens, and EU has their final day on the first reset, both Echo and Pieces managed to kill Halandris. Echo went for a quick look and took a couple pulls on Anduin. They didn't really commit to anything. They had some chores that they wanted to do on that weekly reset with like Mythic Plus and filling up their vaults and whatnot. So somehow they just found more splits to do. And after the reset, Echo and Liquid had pretty much doing mostly the same thing, where they finished their splits and then they started chipping away at Anduin. For some reason, he also proved to be a very difficult boss. Anduin eventually does end up falling, with Liquid taking it down on World First. It was a very thrilling kill, with the only man left standing being the Blood Death Knight. This is the kind of kill that players always hope for, where everybody's used up all their resources, 19 players are dead, and then the tank is the only person left standing. It is truly one of those hype moments that you can only get in World of Warcraft, and it's just an example of how cool raiding can truly be.
Let him focus.
Come on.
Let's go!
So, Anduin dies to Liquid, and this leaves 3 bosses still left to go in the race. Echo also eventually kills Anduin 4.5 hours after Liquid, so Echo is catching up dramatically. Even though the reset just happened, Echo is right on the heels of Liquid here. So, we got the final 3 bosses, and you can either choose Lords of Dread or Rygalon. The initial idea from Liquid, since they were there first, was to go to Lords of Dread, which seemed like it was supposed to be the easier of the bosses, where Rygalon was kind of anticipated to be this like patchwork wall, huge gear check type of boss. And whenever you like looked at the amount of HP, it was just ridiculous. Lords of Dread, it seemed like it was supposed to be more of a mechanics check than a damage check. In Liquid, they end up getting there, and they get the boss to 40% after 7 pulls. Maybe this is the reprieve that we need from Race World First Hell, where we have been just hundreds of pulls on Halandras, hundreds of pulls on Anduin. Maybe Lords of Dread is going to be a little bit easier. Unfortunately, though, the boss was definitely not as easy as it seemed, as very quickly the guilds started to hit the Enrage. Liquid hits the Enrage, and the boss is like nowhere close to being dead. Then Liquid kind of takes a U-turn. They go to Rygalon. Oh, maybe this boss is a little bit more killable. They also soon realized that Rygalon was not any easier of a boss, and as a viewer, you kind of take a look at this and you're just like, oh goodness gracious, we are going to be here for a very long time. So Liquid now has Rygalon at 70% HP, Lords of Dread is at like 20% HP, and they've seen the Enrage, and Liquid's done, and they've called it a day. But if you're Echo here, you've killed Anduin, and you're now starting your day, and you have all of this information that what Liquid has done. And so you see that Liquid has not made strides on either Lords of Dread or Rygalon, so now Echo has really good information on both of those bosses. What do? Well, Echo ends up going to Lords of Dread, and they actually end up killing the boss after only 62 pulls with a raid comp that was stacked with primarily melee specialization and only 4 ranged DPS or ranged players in general. This makes Lords of Dread one of the first bosses in years without a mage in the comp, as the intellect buff would only be relevant for the healers and the token warlock, so basically we didn't need a mage. There was also this narrative at the time where Liquid said that Lords of Dread was mathematically impossible. I'm not actually sure where this narrative came from, and while I started doing research for this video, I'm wondering if like Dratnos and I ended up making up this narrative. Like it could have been legitimately made up. I'm not even 100% sure, but there was a narrative that Lords of Dread was mathematically impossible because for both Echo and the Liquid, whenever they go to kill Lords of Dread, they do this cheeky strategy where they use the Bonesmith cheat death. Bonesmith Aramir's cheat death on Death Knights in order to extend the boss Enrage far past where it was anticipated to go. Because, like I said earlier, Liquid hit the Enrage and the boss is at like 15% HP, so it looked like it was like, oh, okay, this Enrage is insane. But with cheesing it, it was possible. So Liquid yoinks the strategy from Echo. They kill Lords of Dread 3 hours later. Echo ends up going to Rygalon. Now Liquid's on Rygalon, and we have both guilds simultaneously pulling Rygalon, who has a lot of HP. You know, it's going to be one of the hardest patchwork bosses of all time in the hardest raid tier. And by this point in the race, we were in pretty much unprecedented territory. We had the second reset of Mythic Week slowly approaching. 2 bosses are still left standing. At this point, everybody realizes that we're going to the 3rd reset and that double legendaries are on the table, meaning that if you were slacking on your reputation to be able to get double legendaries unlocked, you were in trouble. Fortunately enough, all these Race World First guilds have people who, let's say, have no life, and they were already farming reputation even though it was very unlikely to get to double legendaries. At the same time, you know, we've been here for a very long time, and being fully locked in for that period of time already takes an insane amount of determination, but being away from your family, not sleeping in your own bed, there is a serious mental strain that's being told on all of the players from both of the competing organizations, and everybody's starting to feel fatigue setting in. This race seems to kind of be boiling down to a test of endurance, and for Echo, having killed Lords of Dread before Liquid and establishing a lead of sorts, they kind of get this second win for them, as they're now starting to push down the doors of the Jailer. How is the mental strain on a raid tier that ends up being that long? That is like the first raid tier that we've seen in a very long time that went over 2 resets. Like, what is the mental strain like on a raid tier like that?
I mean, you were there, so you also have some insight into this. I don't know if I felt that big of a difference. Like, obviously you do realize at some point, hey, it's been so many days, like, what's going on? But I don't know, maybe the fact that it was such a good raid, like, I enjoyed the bosses. I don't think that we felt like super exhausted, at least from our side. especially after getting ahead, like on the Dreadlords.
Yeah, Lords of Dread. Yeah.
Yeah, Lords of Dread, yes. Like after getting ahead on Lords of Dread, I think we got kind of like the second wind effect. Like we started getting hyped again. So I would say actually the worst it got was around Halondrus and Anduin. But then when you start getting closer to the end, it almost felt like more excitement. So yeah, I don't know.
Now, the next couple of days, they're about Rygalon and Echo. They're managing to keep the lead that they had found on Lords of Dread, and they eventually end up killing Rygalon on pull 204. Liquid followed suit some hours later, tying up the race with only one boss left standing as we were approaching the third week of Mythic. Now, the guilds, they reached the Jailer on a Monday, right before the third week of Mythic, the week where double legendaries become available. So, we know at this point in time, casters all know this, players all know this, that the boss is going to be killed with double legendaries in some capacity, and so now all of the guilds are kind of scrambling to make sure that everybody's got enough rep. And with this additional time, both Liquid and Echo do end up pulling the Jailer a little bit, but a lot of this time is honestly just spent trying to recoup, recharge, do any additional chores that are ready for the next reset, and just preparing yourself for the long haul that is the final boss in the Jailer. So both resets happen. Echo actually gets to see Liquid do a few hours of pulling the Jailer after the reclear, and at this point, guilds have both seen a little bit of Phase 3, the final phase of the fight, but they really struggled to get their consistency with both Phase 1 and Phase 2, and none of the guilds had really put any serious distance on that final phase. And Echo, their reclear went about as good as it could. Anduin only ended up taking 3 pulls. You know, they were able to kill Halondrus rather quickly, something that seemed impossible. And this is where Echo really starts to kind of break away from Liquid. And on the Jailer, Echo start to look like the definitive favorites to be able to win the race to world first, making bigger strides for every raid day, and they're conserving energy, and it looks like they're just kind of getting that second wind. Blizzard does end up pushing kind of a hotfix to Jailer to nerf the fight a little bit while guilds were progressing it. It doesn't really end up, you know, changing realistically the essence of the race to world first. You know, you do see some large nerfs. Basically what this did was it increased the consistency of guilds for Phase 3, where it reduced the number of people that needed to be alive in Phase 3 to be able to continue to progress the phase. Initially, you had to have all 20 players alive, then it got nerfed down to 17. This meant that, you know, the fight just was easier to continue to see progression on. It wasn't like a kill-changing kind of nerf. And whenever this nerf came through, this is where the learning process sped up and Echo really hit the gas. In the days, they were really slow. You know, at some point we had Liquid and Echo at 48 and 41%. Then it was like Liquid and Echo Liquid was at like 35% and Echo was at 20%. And then it happened. A secret phase. The hardest end boss of all time has a secret phase.
Watch out for the defile. Don't spread the defile. Yeah, if that touches one person, Deep Shade's in a little bit of danger there. Largok also running away. Jailer now at 14%. 4 seconds until in range.
Dragging him out, getting a little bit extra time. All ads are dead.
12.6%.
Just blast the boss, guys. Come on.
And he's
push
walking
the
towards
DPS.
the middle of the room.
Come on, 11%.
11!
10.5.
We need to see 10.5.
Come on, 0.5. Come on. Hit the 10%, guys.
10.
0.2. 10.
10.9. What?
Yeah! We saw it! Let's go! Let's go! We saw it!
Okay,
Secret phase! The wipe happened because the Eternity's end already went off. They have to hit it before. No, man.
But we saw it. This 10% is confirmed.
Holy shit.
It's real. It's real. We're going to get to go home.
And this is something that you just love to see as a viewer and as a caster, just this miraculous secret phase. I remember Dratnos, Gingy, and myself were all casting for Echo at this point in time, and it's just the resonance of we get to go home was like, it was the most genuine thing between the three of us. It was like, oh my god, the boss is almost dead. Please send us home. And in the Liquid camp, having seen the secret phase, and the Liquid continuing to fall further and further behind, Echo wakes up on day 19 of this race. Let me just say, day 19 of this race is insane. And they start to see huge progress, and it was evident very early on that this boss was going to be Echo's kill. Echo did not take their foot off the gas just because of this, though, and they very deservedly took home another World First title as they emerged victorious on the last raid of Shadowlands, the hardest raid of all time.
Keep all debuffs up. Get away from there. Get away from there. And we soak the frontal with one.
In this raid, it goes down in history as one of the most iconic Race to World First ever. It's just unbelievable how long and how difficult it truly was, and having the pleasure of watching Race to World First guilds compete against the hardest content that WoW has to offer in this manner is truly a pleasure. And as Shadowlands finally comes to an end, we now enter Dragonflight. In the game, it saw some pretty big fundamental changes, where there were things like new talent trees, no more borrow power, revamped profession systems. There was like a simultaneous release for Heroic and Mythic all the time. There was also the inclusion of powerful items that were tagged as very rare. And of course, there was the brand new class Evoker with a healer spec and a DPS spec. And then with all of that, we also have a brand new raid and a brand new Race to World First to talk about in Vault of the Incarnates. Now, the biggest change for Dragonflight concerning the Race to World First was definitely the game moving away from borrowed power systems that had been a staple for 3 expansions at this point. This would affect the Race to World First pretty greatly, honestly, as the value of heroic and normal splits would skyrocket. Then you'll factor in the very rare tagged items, which have a lower than normal drop rate, and with their power, all 20 players in your raid basically want them. These are very good items to target for all of your 14 mages if you are one of the persons who mains mage. The Race to World First at this point as well has also gained a huge audience compared to where it first started. So the arms race of adding more and more splits was natural for guilds. Optimizing your splits for even like a 2/10 or a 3/10 of an item level lead could actually make the difference between a world first and losing the race. This raid tier also marked the first time that they would actually release all difficulties at the exact same time, meaning that our top 2 guilds would not step foot into Mythic for the first few days while they were basically doing all of their splits. While simultaneous release is going to be the staple going forward, I would say it's not exactly fantastic for viewership, I will admit. So, for the first couple of days after Vault of the Incarnate released, nothing really happened. The guilds were just kind of doing their splits, and it really wasn't until day 3 of the raid where we finally got some Mythic action just straight across the board. Liquid was the first of the competing guilds to step foot into the raid on Mythic. Shocker, I know. The world first kills on the first and the second boss, though, they did come from this really great guild called Vesper, who happened to have this really good Moonkin player on their roster, believe it or not. A little bit of casting experience, a little bit of world first experience, you know? With the real Race to World First aside, Liquid made swift work of the first couple of bosses as they took down both Aranog and Primal Council in 1 pull. Then they went on to bang out Teros in 5 pulls and Sinarth in 12. Liquid also ended up poking their head onto the Dathia encounter for a couple of hours and choosing to go to there instead of Kurog Grim Totem. And the next day would be fairly similar, with Echo still opting to finish up all of their splits while watching Liquid and gathering information. But Liquid, they didn't really waste any time, and after some initial Mythic Plus farming at the very beginning of the day, they went into the raid to continue their Dathia progression. And Dathia, she was a little bit overtuned, and after a 30% wipe on pull 50, Blizzard decided that the boss was way too hard to kill, and they nerfed the health of the boss by 15%. By the way, just for context, a 15% nerf is massive. Normally people get up in arms about a 5% nerf, but 15 is just crazy. The first pull after this 15% nerf as well, Liquid gets the boss immediately to 7%, and then another 7 pulls after that, the boss dies. And Liquid, well, they were 5 out of 8 before Echo even stepped foot into the raid. Then, loaded with all of the gear and all of the information that they normally have, we see Echo finally enter the raid with an attempt to catch up, which they did in almost no time, spending 1 pull on most of the initial bosses. They ended up spending like 5 on Teros, another 10 on Sinarth. Then they went to Dathia. Even though Dathia had been nerfed, it was still a little bit of a tough wall, rough mechanics check. Echo ends up spending 59 pulls on a boss that Liquid had already killed, which is tough. However, Echo does kill it before going to bed, so no harm, no foul. Liquid, on the other hand, they're farming Kurog Grim Totem, trying to get him killed, and then eventually they kill him on pull 59 after the raid catches another round of nerfs. So for context, this raid tier was also very close to Christmas, and the Blizzard dev team probably didn't want to work over the holidays, I think is the biggest estimate here. And they were sounding the alarms, trying to make sure that the Race World First did not go over Christmas. So yeah, Kurog Grim Totem died, and honestly, this is kind of notable. This is the first raid boss in modern WoW history to have actually been killed without a Warlock present in the world first kill, but just more of a fun fact than anything else. And so the general story for this race so far has kind of been around nerf timings and splits. Really unfun parts of the race world first, admittedly. And more than once now, Liquid has gotten to a boss, spent pulls progressing it, seen Blizzard nerf it while they're sitting there, and then moved on to the next boss. Echo, on the other hand, they have fully tied it up with Liquid. They secured a world second kill in Kura Grim Totem, and for the rest of the day, we were going to be seeing both guilds progressing the penultimate encounter, Broodkeeper Diurna, at the exact same time. And by the end of the day, Liquid were still ahead, but as the boss got lower and lower, the differences got smaller and smaller. Then, Liquid finally reached this 10% mark on the boss. And that's kind of where Echo kicked it into gear, ending up their day only 1% behind Liquid. Except Echo didn't end their day. Even though it was the time that Echo was supposed to be finishing their raid, they decided to stay up a little bit longer to try to secure the Broodkeeper kill. And both guilds were pushing for the final 10% at the exact same time. And for Liquid, they ended up snagging the world first kill on Broodkeeper Diurna, but Echo, they followed suit an hour or so later, so this is a huge deal. And in real time, we're on day 7, and this is due to all the splits, thus we're approaching the new reset. We have both guilds progressing the final boss at the exact same time, and both guilds having spent a few pulls on Raszageth Phase 1, which was an insanely difficult phase, and it straight up made the new Evoker class mandatory in order for everybody to live through the new phase. I will say, though, for Raszageth, the first few pulls of this boss are incredibly iconic as players are just blasted off the platform by hurricane strength winds, and this fight, it looks very, very tough. Okay, so we made it to the reset. Guilds are progressing phase 1 of Raszageth, and Liquid gets a start on all their splits and reclears. Echo's taking a chill day to kind of try to fix their sleep schedule, do a couple chores, that kind of thing, getting themselves ready to start heroic splits at their reset time as well. But even if this was a splits and reclear day, it didn't go without any action, as Blizzard decided that, you know what, maybe we missed the mark a little bit on the Raszageth tuning, and they reduced the intermission add HP, and the phase 1 damage got reduced a little bit. Now, the add HP, I cited earlier that a 15% health nerf was a lot. The add HP got nerfed by 50%. Why do you think the tuning in Vault of the Incarnates was such a big miss, particularly Raszageth? Do you think it was because of talent trees, or is it, sometimes Blizzard just hits you with the Queen Ashara Raszageth type of tier?
I mean, to be honest, that's a good question. I think in reality it was the talent trees, and I'm pretty sure the designer of the boss did not know that you cannot just do AoE and single target at the same time with many classes, right? That was the biggest issue. And then on top of that, I think there were 2 issues. One of them was that they thought we can do AoE single target all the time and it will be fine. And the other thing was that I swear the designer did not think that you go split up the raid or something. I don't know. Whoever did the health tuning, basically. Yeah. Because, I mean, you could barely kill one side with everyone, which indicated that they knew how much damage we will do, which kind of worked on the previous bosses, right?
Yeah.
But it was clearly that one side was put over with everyone, so you had to halve everything, which was, I mean, to be honest, very questionable. I don't think it had happened again, this bad tuning.
So for the EU reset, Echo did wake up at 5 a.m. to start their day, and they didn't end their day until 11 p.m. And after 18 hours of splits and reclear, they were back to Raszageth. They didn't get a ton of progression on this day, but they got some time. And since Blizzard had both nerfed phase 1 damage and the phase 1 intermission, this allowed both Liquid and Echo to kind of springboard themselves forward and bash their head into the Storm Surge shield that exists in phase 2. Unfortunately, they weren't really making much of a dent at it at the time. That is until Blizzard decided to nerf the boss again. With another hotfix seeing the boss's health reduced by another 5%, and the Storm Surge shield reduced by a whopping 50%. This is just a tough look at this point. And it's been pretty clear so far during this raid that Blizzard has missed their initial tuning target. But at this point, there's not really much you can do. We're just kind of hoping that this is the last one for the race. All the casters are kind of over this entire thing because, you go back to Eternal Palace and you have this tuning that completely swings the race. It just feels really shitty. At the same time, if there are any new nerfs that are coming, let's pray they kind of ship them on a time that's not detrimental to one guild and beneficial to the other. And now with Christmas only a couple of days away, it's, there might be another round of nerfs depending on how hard the end of Raszageth really is. But that's just future speculation, maybe. With the phase 2 shield nerfed, we kind of start to see some really big movement on the boss HP itself. Liquid finally take the boss down to 48% from the 65% that they got hard-walled on for forever. Then, we start to see the 9th day of the raid, and this is where things really begin to pick up. Liquid and Echo were, they bust through the Storm Shield. They actually are making it finally to see Phase 3 and virtually seeing to the end of the fight. And when you reach that point of progression where you know that you've seen the end of the fight, the only thing that matters is optimizing your damage for when you're getting there while also trying to get there consistently with all 20 players alive. This would actually prove to be pretty difficult since the enrage would come creeping in and the damage that was taken in the final phase was just really high. Now, Echo, they would have the best attempt at the end of their day, and they would stay in the lead for a pretty extended period of time, reaching 19.6% before ending their day 9. Liquid, during their day 9 as well, they kept going for a little bit, even though it took them a little bit longer to reach Phase 3, but they had gotten a taste of that. They began to lock in, and just 2 pulls after their first introductory pull into Phase 3, they would overtake Echo for a best of 17%. So we're seeing some really intense back and forth here. But this race, as I said, it really revolved around nerf timings. And there would be one final nerf coming out of Blizzard to Phase 3 in particular.
Are you kidding me?
The timing of this nerf would also fall right at the time that Liquid were waking up and their players were going over to the venue to start the day. This would result in Echo actually taking down Razageth like almost before Liquid could even pull the boss, and it allowed them to secure their 3rd world first win in a row before Liquid even had the opportunity to pull the boss after the nerfs. And obviously these nerfs, they left a sour taste in the mouths of the Liquid players. And I remember long-standing tank for Liquid, Ben, he just announces after this that he's quitting the race and citing that constant nerf timings being the main issue. There was also a couple of tweets from Echo Raiders like now addressing that the nerf timings aren't fun for any of them. This was a bit of a fiasco. Echo had 3-peated on the positive note, but everybody's kind of watching this feeling like we missed out on the opportunity to have a really cool race to World First. Obviously you would hope that the tuning would have been right to begin with. At the same time, having tuning timings that are so consequential for the race to World First feels shitty. There's no good way of just kind of tiptoeing around it. So moving forward, you can safely say that between the simultaneous raid difficulties releasing, the new talent trees, renown, profession systems, whatever else, Dragonflight was basically the expansion of reworks. And heading into the 2nd tier of the expansion, Blizzard completely reworked gear progression. Basically, every single item would be put onto different upgrade tracks, and it would allow you to upgrade items with crests that you got from just doing miscellaneous content. For the top race to World First guilds, basically what this ended up meaning meant that you would make big spreadsheets to figure out from the different splits what gear you're getting, where you're going to be spending your crests, what are you going to be crafting on, what classes to use what tier set token on, and what is the optimal way of kind of like spending your crests. Aberrus was also the first raid tier that had this brand new and successful feature, private auras, yay! So basically what would happen was some boss abilities were hidden from add-ons. This made it impossible to create weak auras or add-ons that assigned positions or roles based on what players got the debuffs from these privated aura abilities. Now, how did the players respond? Well, they could create some degenerate workarounds like spam pressing a macro when you got a mechanic to tell your add-on that you have a debuff. Then that add-on, without reading your debuff, could assign people based on whoever pressed the macro. This tech was specifically useful for the penultimate boss in Aberrus, the Echo of Nathria. Similar to Vault of the Incarnates, all raid difficulties are opening at once. This means that there's not a lot of movement during the first couple of days of the race from top guilds. Echo and Liquid are basically just spending all of their possible time doing splits, and they don't enter Mythic until other guilds have killed some bosses, where this time 3 bosses had died during the first 2 days of the raid. The 4th boss died while Liquid was starting to clear up to the first few bosses. And having racked up 442 heroic and normal boss kills so far, and countless amounts of Mythic Plus runs to optimize their gear, Liquid swiftly overtook all the guilds that had killed the bosses before them. And they killed the first 4 bosses in no time, moving on to Rashok, who was in prime position to be the first wall of the raid. This was a single target boss with a lot of stuff to dodge, a pretty tight enrage timer, and it was at a similar spot in the raid where Painsmith was. This ends up meaning that this could be a real test for the guilds, or it could kind of be a pushover. It's hard to really tell. While Echo were still doing splits, Liquid kept pulling Rashok, and they were getting pretty close, repeating wipes at 0.3 and 0.2%. They eventually are able to kill off that boss. Echo, on the other hand, they're finally entering Mythic after dinner on day 4 of the raid being open, and it's kind of crazy, how many splits and how much time it really takes. Liquid ends up killing Rashok after 20 pulls, and they were heading on to Zaskarn. Rashok didn't end up being too much of a wall, but it was definitely the first real challenge of the raid. Even a 20-pull boss for Race World First Guilds, that means that this boss is actually kind of hard, but Race World First Guilds are kind of built different. In Echo, while they might have a little bit of a time disadvantage, they got the EU buff of learning. They're lifelong learners over there, and they enter the raid, and they pretty much tie up with Liquid almost immediately. They kill Rashok in 7 pulls, having basically the entire strategy available to them. And now they are fully caught up with the competition. Echo goes to bed, and Liquid is finally starting to get some pulls on Zaskarn. And Liquid doesn't really waste too much time taking down not only Zaskarn, but also the next boss, Magmarax, with still 3 hours left in their normal raid day. Magmarax, however, this was pretty much a disappointment. Everybody was kind of hoping that this was going to be a well-tuned patchwork single target check. Unfortunately, it only took 17 pulls in like 3 hours for Liquid to get down. After Magmarax dies, Liquid basically just breaks for some chores to get some Mythic Plus done, maybe potentially get some additional crests. There's probably going to be a couple of pulls of Echo of Neltharion off stream, nothing too intense. We're talking like 5 pulls just to test some strategies, test some potential private aura workarounds, those kind of things. And so the next day for both Echo and Liquid, it's pretty similar. Echo wakes up, sees that Liquid have both killed Zaskarn and Magmarax. They yoink the strategies. They down Zaskarn in 37 pulls, Magmarax in 16, and they head towards Echo of Neltharion. And they start pulling Echo of Neltharion first. And even without information from Liquid, Echo begins smashing into Echo of Neltharion, and they end their day 5 with a 24% best pull. Not a bad showing by them. And by the time Echo ended up going to bed, Liquid were sitting at a 47% best with some attempts on the boss as well, but less time spent on the boss and almost their whole day left to try to finish the boss. By pull 30 though, Liquid had tied up Echo's lead, and it took another 8 additional hours before they finally killed the boss. Liquid only had 15 minutes left in their raid day, and at this point in the Race World First, you're going to pull Sarkareth. But it's mostly just to get some timers and think about your comp. We're not having some weird Council of Blood thing happen where the boss could potentially die. So where are we at in the race? Liquid has killed Echo of Neltharion. Echo is waking up here soon, and Liquid is at the final boss. We're rapidly approaching the part of the race where things get really exciting. We kind of call this slingshot season, where you wake up behind and you go to bed ahead. For both Echo and Liquid, this ends up happening. And for Echo, they really didn't disappoint. They ended up killing Neltharion off in their 81st pull, 3 hours before Liquid got to wake up. And for Echo, they've actually started progressing the boss by the time Liquid wakes up. And this meant that it was time for Liquid to sit back and finally watch from some of Echo's strategies. And for Echo, they had an absolutely phenomenal day. They took down Echo of Neltharion. They have Sarkareth down to 49%. And all eyes are kind of now on Liquid to see how far are they going to be able to shoot that slingshot, and are they going to be able to make some real progression on to Sarkareth. And Liquid, they didn't really sit idly by. They kept pulling for a few hours, and they eventually ended at 37% by the time of their dinner break. So there's about 4 hours left in their raid day. Then something weird happens. There's some discussions and there's some whispers in the Liquid camp during their dinner break. And Liquid basically announces on stream that they're going to be turning off competition mode on Warcraft logs and turning off all the streams. They're going to be going dark for a couple of hours.
I'll check. No, I mean we're gonna pull for a little bit off stream and get an early night, which I know is gonna make some people really mad. But I want to be 100% clear. I don't give a fuck. All I care about is winning. I think everything we do after this point tonight is only going to directly benefit our competition, to be completely honest with you. And that's, I don't know, that sounds like a really fucking stupid idea. So, I'll see you guys tomorrow.
This was slightly controversial, and they did end up getting some backlash. But as Max said, the most important part is winning. Everything else comes second. If keeping information about the very last parts of the boss secret gives us the biggest chance to win, then that's the correct decision. Going dark, honestly, also not something that was brand new. It is a little bit weird to take 4 hours on a boss that you're half progressed through. At the same time, it's not the most unprecedented thing ever. Basically, Liquid needs to be able to convert something like this, though. And so the next day arrives. Echo are a few % behind Liquid on the graphics, but they're rapidly getting better and better pulls, and they got that Echo buff. And of course, again, we're in slingshot season, so Echo overtake Liquid early on in the day. We're seeing them pretty low at that 28% marker. But then the craziest thing in Race World First history happens. Around 3 p.m. CEST, so European time, Echo's best pull is at 28%. The Echo players and casters react as the broadcast updates. Liquid has turned on competition mode. And then the craziest thing happened. Liquid shoots up in the standings, revealing that they did an additional 20 pulls off stream the night before, but their best percent was 14.4%. So they were still ahead of Echo's 28%.
Strategies are known to everyone else. They can take them, change them how they like, use it for the comp that they need.
Yeah, and I can't...
Oh, how much pulling did they do off stream last night?
And what had happened, and this is crazy, the Liquid players had woken up at 5 a.m. local time and started pulling the boss by 6 a.m. I don't know how you got that many gamers awake at 5 a.m., but good on them. And for Echo, it was like, oh shit, we're about to lose. And this struck Echo as they begin basically just shotgun pulling the boss. Echo tends to be a little bit more calculated, a little bit slower to pull the boss, but there was no time to analyze because it was like, oh my god, we are going to lose. Now, fortunate enough for Echo, Liquid didn't kill the boss immediately. Unfortunate enough for Echo, it would still take a couple of hours for the boss to die. I think Liquid were hoping that they could like one-shot the boss as they woke up. Echo did get pretty close with a best attempt of 5.8%. It was a fun back and forth for a little bit. This was until Liquid managed to finally finish off the boss and secure their win in Aberrus world first, retaking the spot as the best guild in the world, blocking Echo for winning their 4th race in a row.
Keep the infinite duress alive. Just external them, I'll call their name.
I got go.
Drama time! I think we've been due. So the first thing that actually happens in Amirdrassil for the Race World First is something that happened before the raid was even released. As it tends to, players get bored, then they decide that they want to exploit some stuff. So basically what happened is a handful of Race World First players ended up doing something that we call seed farming for reputation in the brand new zone. They were rolled back on their characters for abusing a bug involving planting seeds and growing flowers. The reputation would end up giving you the infinite augment rune and a free hero track crest. So getting rolled back wasn't great because it cost you additional hero track crests on crafting. It ended up kind of being nothing, but it was still pretty stupid. I remember, the community was more mad than anybody else realistically was. If you look out for the landscape of the Race World First, this doesn't really affect that much. But anytime people are getting rolled back or banned, we gotta talk about it. Additionally, with Aberrus fresh in their memory and all talks of the NA head start, and EU is always late, Echo has announced something drastic. They have announced before the release of the raid that they were going to be playing on NA. Now, they didn't actually end up playing the race on NA, but what they had done is they had created characters, geared said characters, made a guild, and then they fought the Amirdrassil bosses on the first night before EU reset. They did end up basically going and getting world first on normal difficulty before going to bed and waking up early for EU splits. This was mostly just a publicity stunt to help the Echo esports broadcast. I thought it was very funny and tongue-in-cheek. I thought it was really cool by Echo to do something like this. Very funny. As for the race itself, the first couple of days of the race are going to be similar to what we kind of come to expect at this point. We're doing a lot of splits. At that point, on day 3 or 4, either Liquid or Echo are going to be entering Mythic, and then they're going to mow down the bosses that had not yet been killed, reach a wall, and then we're going to kind of continue to pivot there. For this raid, nothing, dissimilar happens. Liquid goes in after 3 days of splits. They end up claiming some of the world first kills. Both Echo and Liquid, they end up actually mowing down the first 3 bosses rather quickly. Echo ends up killing the 4th boss rather quickly, then having trouble on the 5th boss in Laredar, where Liquid was able to mow down Laredar rather quickly. On top of having time to kill off Laredar and Ny'alotha, Liquid also are able to take down Smolderon, which that basically took 56 pulls into what people thought was going to be a pretty big wall. Realistically, this fight was kind of hard, but it wasn't the hardest thing ever. Smolderon was honestly notable for having the first instance of the private aura workaround macro nonsense, where weaklers were able to read macro inputs of players that were targeted by debuffs on Smolderon. It was all just a bunch of nonsense, and I remember at this time as well, people were not happy that Smolderon had been private aura'd and that there was a workaround for it, so it just made that fight a lot worse. Echo, while having a pretty tough intro to Mythic, they wake up, they dust themselves off, and they finish off the next 2 bosses. They get to Smolder Run before sinking a couple of pulls into him and killing the Fire Lord just in time for Liquid to wake up. Now, basically, Liquid and Echo, they are staring down the penultimate encounter of the raid, Tendril Sage Swift. And the guilds, they pretty quickly find out that this version of Tendril Sage Swift that they fought in raid testing was very different than the live version that was testable. It's been described as if Blizzard had taken that Tendril Sage Swift and then given him permanent Bloodlust. There's a ton of pass-fail mechanics on this boss. That was absolutely insane. This was also the first fight where Blizzard incorporated the brand new dragon riding feature that came with the expansion, with some players having to mount up during combat and fly above the platform, picking up these big fire orbs and slam down on your team to free them from being rooted. I remember a clip of JPC where he's just like completely missing the orb for an extended period of time. It was really funny. But by far, the hardest part of this fight, though, was 16 members of your raid needed to soak seeds on the ground at 3 seconds. Basically, the boss would summon these seeds on the ground, and everybody had to walk over one. If you walked over more than one, your raid instantly exploded. If not all the seeds were soaked within a 3-second window, then your raid exploded. And that created a situation similar to Halandra's bombs going off, where just 1,000 pulls were going to be taken before this fight goes down because of just how difficult that one singular mechanic is. And after just one day of guilds pulling the boss, it was pretty clear to anyone watching that this boss could take a couple of days, and the race was going over the reset. People had already also started talking about the boss needing to get nerfed, where some raiders in both Echo and Liquid begged on Twitter for the boss to not get nerfed. However, Blizzard did not listen, and they shipped a 20% HP to the boss, also increasing the time that players had to soak seeds. Now, you might expect this to allow the boss to immediately die. Unfortunately, it was not that easy. The boss, as it turns out, even 20% less healthy, was still very challenging, and for the final day of the first NA reset, we had some hours of both guilds pulling Tendril at the exact same time. And they were running into issues in Phase 1 and Phase 2 for parts of the day, because the fight is legitimately impossible to stay consistent on, with just how soaking those seeds realistically worked. In Echo, they finished their day at a 38.6% mark. In Liquid, they procced a few good hours of pulls, they went to dinner, and they came back, and they ended up having the boss all the way down to 24%, over 387 pulls taken for them to have the boss still at 24%. And so we're going into the new reset. New reset comes. For Liquid, it's filled with their reclear, another rounds of splits. Echo ends up getting some attempts on Tendril during their like half-day window where they're a little bit behind. They end up going to bed a bit early to get an early night to prepare for their 5 a.m. reset. Liquid's reclear was efficient, though. They were back on Tendril fairly quickly, and they downed the boss within 30 pulls. All the way up to 426 pulls, the Boomkin boss fell, almost overtaking Fallen Avatar for the highest pull count on a penultimate boss ever, but definitely the hardest one we've ever seen. Again, just the pass-fail insta-wipe mechanics make that fight unbelievable. And at this point, for Liquid, you down Tendril, you finish your reclear, you finish your chores, you're pretty late in your day. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to turn your streams off, and you're going to pull Fire Rack like probably 15 attempts before bed, get some weak auras, do some testing on things that you might think could happen based off of what you've seen from that boss on Heroic, and then for Liquid, you're going to bed. Echo, during their reclear, kind of a similar story. They wake up at 5 a.m., they have their resets, and they're back in front of Tendril at 4 p.m. local time, 11 hours after their raid started. Not bad. And for Liquid, we saw they took 30 pulls to be able to kill the boss. For Echo, you're kind of expecting them to take 3 to 4 hours to be able to get 30 additional pulls. So you're kind of expecting Echo to be able to kill the boss rather quickly. And for Echo, they actually have some really good progression pulls early on, getting a 5% attempt within the first hour. But unfortunately, this is a boss that is impossible to find consistency, and it takes them over 5 hours before they get another 5% wipe. And then at this point in time, their raid had gone on for 17 hours, and it was clear that they had not gotten over the finish line yet. And for Echo, they made the call to end their raid at midnight local time. At this point, it's 11:30. So they have another 30 minutes to pull. And the next pull after this call is made, they have a 3% wipe. Then another 16% wipe. Okay, the end time is creeping up, but they have one more attempt. And in some mythical fashion, Echo always ends up playing their best under pressure, and at the last pull of the night, number 399 in total, after 19 hours of playing, they downed the Boomkin. And with that, they could breathe a big sigh of relief as they were now fully caught up to Liquid. At the same time, you have to be a little bit worried because now Echo is 17 hours behind Liquid. So Echo is going to have to be in full catch-up mode at this point. And so after Echo has gone to bed, Liquid, they're here. They're streaming their first real pulls on Firac. They're easily pushing past the Phase 1 intermission in the beginning, but they spent a couple of hours trying to figure out how to deal with the shield while soaking orbs in the intermission. There's also some private aura stuff that makes this fight pretty complicated. And just getting players organized without add-ons and without weak auras is actually proving to be pretty tough. Then Liquid hits around pull 50. They enter P2. They get like a pretty decent attempt on the boss. And with that new information, they zone out of the raid. They go for some Mythic Plus farming. And they mute their comms. So whenever they're muting their comms, they're talking about potential comps and strategies for Phase 2. And they had been muted for like an hour doing chores at this point. Then they unmute, basically saying that they're going dark to do practice stuff before going to bed. This feels pretty reminiscent of Sarkareth, I have to admit. And everybody's kind of like, oh, wait. Is it about to happen again where they're just going to show up tomorrow with the boss at like 5% HP, kill the boss? It would be a little bit of a buzzkill, admittedly, but, you know, at the same time, winning the race to world first is honestly more important than showing all of your pulls on stream. And if you're going to put yourself at a severe disadvantage, all of the race to world first teams will elect to go dark. In retrospect, it's pretty likely that the practice stuff that was mentioned was referring to the ads that spawn in a line across the platform and figuring out how players could coordinate knockbacks and grips in order to be able to gather the ads. I also heard rumors after the fact that there was potential use of things like Vengeance, Demon Hunter, and whatnot, trying to see like what was possible for getting these ads gathered as quickly as possible. But for Echo, you know, they can't really let up. The next day, it was slingshot season for Echo, and taking what they had gathered from Liquid, from all of their attempts in Phase 1 and Phase 2, and spending almost the entire day for Echo, they reached Phase 3. Unfortunately enough for Echo, though, they go and turn off their streams, pull a few attempts before going to bed a few hours early, and at this point, it was getting increasingly common and kind of annoying that any guild that was in first place would immediately turn their stream off to make sure that the other team could not get additional information, right as we were reaching a new phase where cool things were happening. So people were not happy about this. In the middle of all of this happening, where we're getting into Phase 3, we're seeing a new phase. The seed carrying is getting a bit precarious, kind of similar to Tendril Stage Swift pass-fail mechanics. Firac also has an integral pass-fail mechanic where you have to carry seeds around. And the boss receives a 4% health nerf. And at this point, both of the guilds are lifting the veil of darkness. Echo was actually in the lead at this point with a 19% PB and Liquid at a 27% PB. And this is kind of where everybody believes that the race is going to end. 19 and 27% on the final boss, especially after a nerf to the boss HP. Everybody's kind of looking forward to the end of the race looming. However, Echo hits a 20-hour raid day, and they can't kill the boss, and their best is actually 8%. So, as it turns out, the final phase of Firac is just incredibly hard. There's a lot of blaze line and seed carrying management that's pretty difficult, and a ton of pass-fail mechanics that can wipe you on a moment's notice. And the precise and clutch moments that were needed for Phase 3 of Firac, those were insane. And you were basically carrying this seed around, adopting kind of the similar situation from the hot potato mechanic on Halandris. The players were juggling the seeds between two different players that were taking damage on them. If the seed gets hit by an ability, it's an instant wipe. If the player gets hit by an ability, it's an instant wipe. If anybody died who was carrying a seed, that was going to be pretty much a wipe. That was inevitable. Players also had to deal with blaze lines and random swirlies on the floor while making sure their seed didn't get hit by anything. But Echo's day, it was over. 8%. And for Liquid, this is the opportunity that they need to be able to finish it off. If Liquid are unable to kill this boss pretty quickly while Echo's sleeping, it is unlikely that they are going to be able to win the race world first. And Liquid end up pushing pretty deep into the night. They do have several late P3 wipes, and they push their raid time back a couple of hours. And unfortunately, they decide that they are going to be going to bed with the boss at 6%. Meaning that very, very likely whenever they wake up, Echo is going to having down the boss. However, the craziest shit happens. Echo starts their raid, and, you know, the boss is not that much lower whenever Liquid wake up. And then what would happen over the next couple of hours is going to make Race to World First history, as both guilds, Liquid and Echo, are getting consecutively low wipes down as low as 1% at the exact same time. And whenever you wipe the seeds exploding in phase 3, it just kills the raid instantly. This kind of leads to some really weird anticlimactic moments of the boss looking like it's going to die until one small misstep wipes the raid. That's why you can't celebrate on a boss like Fyrakk, because there's always the possibility of something going tragically wrong and you wiping at 1%. And Echo, they started their day at 8%. At 10 p.m. CEST, after hours and hours of back and forth, Echo finally are able to secure the kill and take back the throne as the best guild in the world. It took them 340 attempts. They were really far behind coming into Tendril Sage Swift, but they were able to make magic happen. This moves Amirdrassil into the top 4 Race World First pull counts, and almost the entirety of this was Tendril Sage Swift and Fyrakk. And oh yeah, you remember whenever I mentioned private auras whenever we were talking about Aberrus earlier? They were a little bit more prevalent on Fyrakk. This boss had 2 key mechanics that were both private auras, making players click macros in order for a weak aura to assign how to deal with that mechanic. While these mechanics were technically possible to do without a weak aura, it was just a lot more consistent to use the weak aura, proving time and time again that private auras are rarely useful since there's always a workaround. And that leads us to this insane drama alert. So, God, first off, God, this video has a lot of drama. But secondly, you remember those private auras that we were talking about in Fyrakk? Yeah, so there was a program surrounding them, and it was called Sneak.Lua. While it was not known or public during the Amirdrassil Race to World First, it would get out over like probably 6 months after this that Echo had created a script that would press a macro for you if you were affected by the private aura in question. The script was named Sneak.Lua. It also had a built-in random delay so that it wouldn't be obvious to any of the Race World First competitors or viewers that a script was being used to be able to bypass these private auras. This ended up cutting down Echo's pull count on Fyrakk by a significant amount, and Liquid basically suffered probably 50 wipes to mistakes related to the macro itself. It's been stated on the record by players that they're pretty sure that Echo loses without Sneak.Lua. And many people called this cheating, mostly because it was. No action does end up getting taken against the members of Echo, and the thing that makes this the most different from tech or clever use of game mechanics was mostly due to the concept that private auras are added to the game with the specific reason to not be bypassed. And Echo bypassed them. That's why it was like cheating, right? And this is probably the most controversial thing the Race World First guilds have ever done, and it really has pushed the line for what's allowed and what isn't allowed. And coming off the back of Sneak.Lua, you know, you thought players, they were going to play it safe. But we got something new. Brand new rep exploits, because we needed more of those. Exploit early, exploit often, they say. Except this time, Blizzard ended up banning people. Good news was that it was only a 4-day ban. Bad news was that it was a couple of players in Echo, and most of the entire Method roster at this point, got caught up in a ban the day before the raid opened. Now, we talked about Heroic Week going away and how that ended up creating the split culture after Mythic opened, but the good news with this entire situation was that Heroic Week was back for Nerubar Palace, and this meant that the bans didn't really do anything, but some very mad Redditors wanted a few players' heads for sure. So, you know, drama aside, raid launches, and we are fortunate enough as viewers to have far fewer splits on Mythic since Heroic Week has returned. This means that we are graced with NA's Liquid, downing the first 4 bosses, all in one-shots. Was its raid under 2 was a pretty popular question at this point in the race. This was up until we saw what was next for the Race World First guilds. Root Twister Ovanax and Nexus Princess Kaiveza were the next couple of bosses that you could attempt, and both were just absolutely insane. Ovanax was an insane coordination check with things like egg breaks, CCing the mites, you needed to land kicks, and those were all like the biggest parts of difficulty on this encounter. The tank damage was also insanely high, and then all of it ended up culminating in guilds just standing in the black blood effect on the ground and out healing it with preservation evokers for as long as possible after the enrage was supposed to be over. But that was just Ovanax. Kaiveza, on the other hand, was perhaps the hardest tuned damage check that has ever been killed. He required a strategy which involved one tanking the boss, and you would utilize things such as soul stoning, battle reses, and Resto Shaman's Ancestral Protection Totem to facilitate a one-tank strategy as it reset your debuff. On top of this, you could also get one shot at any time as a DPS or a healer, immediately ending your pull, because you're utilizing all of your battle reses on your tank. And so both of these bosses were just absolutely ridiculous. And, you know, for the landscape of just raiding in general, they ended up being pretty massive guild killers. But they also came after an easy boss in Rashana. And if you thought we were done with drama, you were wrong. There was actually more drama inside of Nerubar Palace surrounding the Star Liquid Mage I'm Fired Up. The TLDR on this was he was basically exploiting a Spellslinger hero tree interaction by turning all of his abilities into at-focus abilities. This ended up giving him what I would describe as slightly more DPS on Kaiveza than he otherwise would have. And this ended up leading to this tweet by the recently banned Genji. Fired Up, however, he didn't get any punishment for this beyond public backlash. Blizzard ended up fixing the bug. The bug was also fairly low magnitude in terms of how much damage it gave you, and Liquid was unable to kill Kaiveza even with the added damage by their mage. So fairly low impact on the actual race world first, even though it was still an exploit. But if Liquid did kill this boss with this exploit, and say Echo was actually unable to kill the boss without using it, it really makes you kind of think how people would have viewed this. But it was kind of whatever. Anyway, when the dust had settled on both of these massive walls, Liquid had killed both the 5th and 6th boss ahead of Echo, but not before taking 120 pulls for Brute Twister Ovanax and 304 for Nexus Princess Kaiveza. And it was pretty clear at this point in time that the race was going to be going to the reset. The penultimate encounter was just started to be attempted in Silken Court, and a lot of people didn't expect Silken Court to go down week 1 given what we had seen thus far in the raid. People kind of anticipate more linear difficulty, which means we're going to be strapping in for the long haul. But Silken Court, it was a little bit easier than what linear difficulty would make you assume. It was fairly challenging in the sense that there was pretty large intermission shields that had to be broken, but a large part of difficulty of Silken Court was the dance itself. This was like basically making sure all of your players were in the right places at the right time. And race rule first guilds tend to be pretty good on encounters that require high consistency. So this kind of leads us up to the Monday night before the reset, and Liquid is actually very, very close to a Silken Court kill. Echo, at the same time, they're hot on their heels, having had a slightly better raid tier compared to Liquid up until this point. At the same time, Liquid really needs to get Silken Court killed off. They were losing some key pieces of gear if they're not able to kill it. They also made some vault decisions that were with the assumption that Silken Court was going to die on reset 1, and so it's a pretty big deal for Liquid to be able to down the boss. And so the end of the raid night comes for Liquid, and they barely down Silken Court right before immediately going to bed. Race World first, I would say they have a tendency to have like make or break moments where the actual impact of these moments is fairly low. So like Silken Court, all it's really going to yield you is a couple pieces of gear and a couple of vault slots, but the momentum and the morale hit that you get from being able to down Silken Court on reset 1 versus, you know, you watch Echo kill it on reset 1 and you're not able to, that's a really big deal. So it's more psychological than it is like, you know, the reality warping. But at the same time, Liquid killed the boss, Echo comes in the next day before their reset, and they clean house on Silken Court as well, killing it around, I would say, 6 p.m. local time. And both guilds had killed 7 bosses through the first reset. And now we are finally on to Ansarek, and Ansarek awaits. In what I can only describe as the hardest boss of all time, Queen Ansarek was just absolutely insane. Phase 1 required you to play near perfect with the reactive froth drops and making sure that you didn't end up hitting 2 at the exact same time. The P2 intermission was just bananas, as the DPS check on the P2 intermission on breaking the shield in time was completely otherworldly. P2 itself ended up causing both Liquid and Echo hundreds and hundreds of wipes alone, because the damage check on getting the Ad's shield broken was also just as stupid as the Phase 1 shield getting that broken in time. And this was a fight where, similar to Kaiveza, if you were down a single player, you would immediately be wiping. Fortunately enough, you did have battle reses on this fight, unlike Kaiveza, but you couldn't meet any of the damage checks if you were trying to 19-man it. They would also use what I would describe as progression bloodlusts, both Echo and Liquid did, in order to be able to continue to see progression on the fight at a moment in time that made the most sense. It was pretty just free form as to when it was going to be used. Early on, a lot of the time it was used on the intermission shield, and later it was used on the P2 ads. The damage check in Phase 3 was pretty unknown at this point. You know, everybody was kind of playing with the assumption that you're going to need it for the Phase 3 push, especially by not having the Bloodlust at a very set time. Hard to really say, is it going to be required for that P3 push? So P2 and P1 progression, you know, it's not very steady. There's a lot of wipes in Phase 1, even though the guilds were progressing Phase 2. And this was until both Liquid and Echo broke through the P2 checks at 140 and 132 pulls respectively. And while P3, it's also unbelievable. You get the mythic mechanic And basically, it's the vulnerability associated with carrying orbs across the ring from the Acolyte drops. And basically, you get ever-increasing amount of these orbs that drop off these Acolytes, meaning that the tanks have to run orbs with a 500% vulnerability at some point in time, creating a crazy situation on this encounter. At this point in time, the casters and the players don't even know if it was even possible. However, on day 10, we have a real breakthrough in terms of what's actually going on this fight. Liquid, they find consistency in the inconsistent. They make it to P3 on probably what is 75% of their attempts, and Echo, on the other hand, who is historically a more calculated and consistent team, has a terrible day 10, where they were not making it to Phase 3 nearly enough, wiping time and time again in both Phase 1 and Phase 2, which we talked about being very turbulent. So give it up for day 11. Liquid shows up on day 11, and the boss actually gets nerfed. And when I say it gets nerfed, it's not like a Razagath or a Queen Ashara nerf, it's just a very light touch to help you get through parts of the fight that nobody's made it to. It just lowers the damage intake on some of the crazier overlaps, and, well, Liquid continues to have an exceptional day for day 11. They end up hitting the Enrage on the Queen Ansarek encounter at 15%. We're kind of having N'Zoth flashbacks at this point, nearly 6 years ago. How are you supposed to find 15% boss HP? Obviously, there's still optimizations, and I would describe it as like comfort damage that happens whenever you're able to make it to a part of the encounter over and over again. Your damage just eventually increases. But everybody's kind of wondering, is Blizzard going to need to step in and intervene with like a 5% health nerf or something like that? How do you even begin to find 15% boss damage even after you've moved the Bloodlust onto the boss itself in P3? Dratnos and I ended up discussing it on our recap at the time, but Echo at this point in the race had basically a 0% chance of killing the boss before Liquid on day 12. Liquid had a chance, but it was basically going to involve elite DPS, and then there was always the chance that the damage check is not makeable at all, and we are in trouble. Good news, because day 12 showed up, and Blizzard didn't need to intervene. Liquid was able to down Ansarek world first, with Echo grabbing a close second on the hardest end boss of all time. 404 pulls.
Come on!
Crazy. It's just so hard to create a boss if you're Blizzard that is 400 pulls, and at the exact same time, it's also killable. So kudos to Blizzard in that regard for creating one of the most interesting in bosses in history. There's also one last shout out that I want to give for this tier. THD, on his Warlock, he had to have made one of the, I would describe it as the craziest plays individually I've ever seen on Liquid's Ansarek kill. Raiding tends to be more of like a team sport than something an individual's plays play an integral role on, but he had one of the craziest Warlock gate-saving plays I've ever seen, and we are so lucky that we have the Race for World First broadcast on a world stage, so plays like that can actually be seen. And with over 1,000 cumulative pulls, Nerubar Palace cements itself in elite company with only Sepulcher the first ones, and Tomb of Sargeras as truly one of the hardest raids of all time. Now, coming off the hardest tier ever, nobody really knew what to expect. With insanely hard tiers, Blizzard tends to have a bit of difficulty thrash, where things swing back and forth to more easy than they were extremely hard. We've had Amirdrassil into Nerubar, which is 2 insanely difficult raid tiers in a row, where people were not happy with just how hard they were. We're probably due for an Aberrus level tier at this point. Raid opens up, and you kind of know the drill about tiers without Heroic Week. There's no Heroic Week in Liberation of Undermine. We're due for 3 days minimum of splits, hundreds and hundreds of characters. Very rare loot is probably the most important it ever has been, with items like the Jasper Diamond, the Eye of Kazan, and the House of Cards all being gigabits for pretty much every single spec in the game. This meant that you needed just a god split for your Race for World First character for it to be playable, where you got all 3 of these items. And Echo and Liquid at this point, well, they're just running 15 splits apiece, so the race doesn't really kick off until Friday, 4 days after the raid opens. And let me just say, as a Race for World First viewer and player of the game, I hate this part of raiding. As a Mythic raider, realistically, all you want more than anything is to go into Mythic the moment it opens up. Being straddled with needing to do Heroic once, twice, or I guess in Race for World First case, 100 times, is just a huge vibe killer. My complaining aside, Friday shows up and Race for World First guilds finally enter the raid. And the first 2 bosses, their cake. Rick Reverb is a surprisingly difficult damage check for a 3rd boss, and then we have a 4th boss wall. Styx Bunk Chunker, he's not having it. In this fight, he'll probably go down in history as one of the hardest 4th bosses ever, usurping Lady Ashfane. And the difficulty of why it's hard is really, really stupid. And it's attached to 1,000 pass fill mechanics, which are all really stupid, whether it be, you didn't run over the Scrapmaster in time, you accidentally ran into a crab bomb, you don't have enough DPS to get the bombs out of the ground, you had players selected to get the ball at the wrong time who were going to be propping their offensive CDs, you had a healer get selected at the wrong time, you didn't have the perfectly crafted comp for the 4th boss that wasn't particularly good for anything else in the raid. Who really knows what to say about a fight like this? It's so rare that you actually need a comp stack for a 4th boss, much less balanced druids, who were largely not geared by Race World First guilds, since they sucked. So Styx took 115 pulls, Echo ends up killing it around 5 hours after Liquid, and the race is incredibly close, even though we're only 4 bosses in. Styx died on a Saturday, so we're definitely going to have a Nerubar 2.0, and we're not going to have a 1-week Race World First. And the reason that this was known was because there was a choice between the guilds. Did you want to go to Sprocketmonger Lockenstock, or did you want to go to Styx Bunkjunker? And the fact that the guilds chose Styx Bunkjunker first meant that Sprocketmonger was not going to be something that you could just walk over. What exactly is the process to kind of follow whenever, especially an early boss like Styx being the 4th boss in a raid, whenever a boss is that hard, do you just continue to pull it? Are there more splits to potentially be done? What do you kind of do whenever an early boss is that hard?
I mean, I think it's difficult because most of the time splits are always done beforehand, and you only do splits for certain characters that are random procs, I guess. Let's say Styx, there was Boomkin procs that you needed, and you just did the split for Boomkin, right? But most of the time, I think all Race World First guilds just make a plan. They gear like, I don't know, 50 characters for everyone, like to cover every base, basically in every setup possible. And that is in the split plan, and you just run the splits and you're done. And then there's only last minute resurrections of some classes, of some players, I guess, potentially, if some crazy things happen. And I mean, I think with Styx, the thing was that we had the setup ready. I mean, Liquid had the setup to some degree ready as well, I think. Like we knew that we wanted to go in with all the range classes and whatever. We obviously didn't expect that the boss will be this crazy OP, I guess, towards us. But we did kind of have everything ready, so that was good. There was some misplay on some crafting on one alt or whatever, which was a bit scuffed. But I mean, if an early boss is this difficult, the main thing I think that always happens is that you try to gear all the characters while you swap in and out of progress, because it's not the end of progress. You're still thinking about all the characters you geared. And you might need to gear, I don't know, the Windwalker for the next boss. Like you knew Windwalker was OP in that tier, right? So you geared like the classes that you knew were OP for later bosses as well, and put them on the bench, even if they were maybe okay on the current boss. Put them on the bench, gear them, and I think that's how it often goes if the progress is still ongoing for long, right? I think oftentimes it happens to many guys as well that if you're on the 7th boss or 8th boss or whatever, I mean, the setup is not changing that much anymore, unless there's some secret phase, of course. So you probably don't care, I guess, and people can do other things that benefit the guild apart from gear their character. But if it's early progress, I mean, you'd only gear always, right? And especially with the upgrade system and crest save and third series and, I don't know, all the shenanigans, you can farm many things, I guess. And that's always the main issue as well, right?
And Sprocketmonger was next, and now that is a cool boss to make hard. While Styx had Fyrakk and Halandris-esque moments of just raid-wide one-shots that nobody understood, Sprocketmonger is more of a controlled dance with intense micro, a pretty hefty DPS check, and everything kind of culminated in a phase 3 where all the mechanics were thrown at you at the exact same time, and getting hit by anything wipes the raid. It was really a beautiful encounter, very cool for the Race World First whenever you're watching fights like that. And for Liquid and Echo, they're simultaneously pulling the boss, and the reset comes and goes, and Sprocketmonger's still alive. And so we're strapped in for a really long race. The reset came and went for Liquid. And Echo, somehow, they actually down Sprocketmonger lock and stock on their first reset. And without Liquid being able to do it. And this is probably, in this video, the earliest Limit or Liquid has lost a world first kill since Lady Ashbane. This is one of those kills that doesn't mean much in terms of loot, but it can actually feel incredibly demoralizing, especially when Echo smells blood in the water, a huge momentum shifter for a guild like them, and they were able to do this off of utterly ridiculous chain P3 attempts with insane amounts of battle reses available in an incredibly impressive fashion that everybody takes notice and is like, wow, they are very good. So that was boss 5. 3 bosses separate these teams from the finish line, though, and we have One-Armed Bandit, Mugsy, and Gallywix. One-Armed Bandit, it dies without issue. Liquid ends up killing it world first off the back of their reclear. If anything, Echo actually kind of throws away all of their lead on One-Armed Bandit, but I think it's pretty neutral given what the reset does. Then the teams enter Mugsy. In Mugsy, it was insanely difficult, mostly off the back of an insanely hard Phase 2 that had a lot of stupid bugs. The mines would sometimes not blow up correctly. The ramping damage the boss did from the enrage mechanic wiped people time and time again. And for context, Racer World First guilds spent probably 75% of their progression time just in P2, and it felt like guilds were really just gambling attempts, praying that one person didn't die in P2 due to how tough the damage check was on top of the jank mechanics. So now we're down to the wire. Liquid started Mugsy first. Echo has gotten more gear from Sprocketmonger over the course of this race. Historically as well, Echo just kind of has this ability to be able to have unreal consistency when it feels impossible to kind of have consistency. And then, Liquid are able to figure it out. Liquid downs Mugsy first, and Echo ends up actually choking on this boss pretty hard. And so, what does choking mean in this context? Echo spends an additional 8 hours over Liquid in progression time on Mugsy. This, compounded with the lost time on One-Armed Bandit, puts Echo at nearly 17 hours behind Liquid. So now it's possible to recover from this, as we've seen. We've seen some crazy stuff, especially like Tendril Sage Swift and Fire Act. That was until the Gallywix incident. So Gallywix as an encounter didn't have much stated in the dungeon journal about Mythic at all. In fact, pretty much all of it was absent. Players were wondering about a secret Mythic phase, but nothing was caught on data mining. So pretty much everybody knows if there's a secret phase or not due to what's unveiled during data mining. So it felt unlikely that that was going to be the case. Maybe it could be encrypted, but unlikely. And doing a boss without the dungeon journal, effectively blind, can be unbelievably difficult. Unfortunately, Gallywix ends up being far easier than anybody anticipates. And I like to tend to hype up end boss kills. They take the longest, the most drama happens on them. The guilds enter slingshot mode where one guild is overtaking one another. They go to bed ahead and they wake up behind. This is typical for Racer World First kills. Now for Gallywix, this was a boss of all time for sure. And to cut to the chase, Gallywix died in 24 hours for Liquid and 16 hours for Echo. This is probably the most anticlimactic finish to a Racer World First ever, due to the final boss being fairly undertuned. And more than anything, Gallywix just kind of lacked tension. There was no hard damage check, no phase was individually difficult, it all just felt kinda easy. And I'll let this clip of Preach take it away as how it was received from a Racer World First level.
Embarrassing, complete fucking calamity. Yeah, a lot of words like that were being thrown around. I was furious, I'm not gonna lie. I'm literally furious with what they did during that raid. I don't think we'll ever get an answer as to what the hell happened there. There is a million crackpot theories running around about what happened, but ultimately, embarrassing is the word I will go with. Absolutely embarrassing for Blizzard. I have never in my life, and I really racked my brain. Did they forget a phase? I don't know. Like, if I run the fucking gauntlet of crackpot theories. 1, they didn't turn on the triggers for whatever was supposed to happen. 2, they deliberately didn't turn on the triggers for what was supposed to happen so the race would end. 3, they legendary ringed us and literally didn't come up with anything at all. 4, they somehow ran out of time to create whatever the mythic phase is going to be. All of those theories may or may not be true. I have no idea. I have actually no idea, but embarrassing.
There's also an iconic moment where THD and Max at the exact same time are in utter bewilderment as the boss ended up dying for Liquid. THD was basically dead for 2 entire minutes on the world first kill. In the raid, it was really fun as a raider, but for Racer World First, it was definitely deflating seeing the end boss be that easy. And as it turned out, Echo ended up playing the best for probably 6 out of the 8 bosses, but their utter collapse on Mugsy and just wasting a ton of time on One-Armed Bandit ended up losing them the race.
What?
How bad does it feel whenever you have a tier like Undermine where there is a stark difference in difficulty between a penultimate fight like Mugsy and an end boss like Gallywix? Is it like super demoralizing, or like does it feel just because you guys put in so much prep and you kind of expect a linear difficulty, right?
I mean, it's very disappointing, I think, because I think Undermine, if Gallywix would have been a good boss, I think Undermine would have been my favorite raid of this expansion, for sure. Because I think the bosses were good, The bosses were tuned for Race World First, clearly. Many of them, maybe too much as well, right? They were great design. I think the vibe of the raid was cool. The theme, overall, like they had different kind of bosses. Like Magzi was a very difficult healing and coordination check, right? And I mean, also maybe Vikara, but a lot of tech issues as well at that boss. But I think overall the bosses were offering a lot of stuff. Where Styx was like more of a personal gameplay fight, and One Armed was like a together kind of problem-solving fight, which was a little bit undertuned, sadly, I think. But overall was good. I mean, the main issue, I think, with that tier in general was, or if a pin ultimate boss is this much harder than the final boss, is that the race is so bad in terms of how bosses are laid out, that most of the time you reach the pin ultimate boss before the first weekly reset, right? As a race toward first guild. And then kind of the current tier was a good example. We reach the boss, and Liquid reaches the boss, and you can't kill it.
Yeah.
Because it's too difficult. And I think that's always the tuning Blizzard is going for, because they don't want the race to end in 1 week. Probably. That's my assumption. So they always tune it so the pin ultimate boss does not die. Or it's like some crazy check, or potentially one guild kills it or something. I don't know. And then if you kill that boss, you like if you kill the penultimate boss, you should be looking forward to like progress on the final boss for like, I don't know, 4 more days or 3 more days, right? In that sense. But if you kill the penultimate boss and then the other boss just dies like Gallowix, I mean, it's very boring as well, I think. Like even like I would say, like many people always say, or people say Undermine was so bad or whatever. I think Undermine was great raid. Apart from Gallowix, of course, and I think it could have been the best race or the best raid to look at or whatever in the whole tier if the boss would have lived a little bit longer, right? And I think a big issue with a boss that is shitty tuned as well is that it's so weird, right? Because we went to bed and we were looking at Liquid and we're like, does the boss maybe die? Because they made a lot of progress early on, right? And we're like, maybe we shouldn't go to bed, but that would have been very difficult, right? There's always a should have if situation, I guess, right? But we're like, maybe we shouldn't go to bed, maybe we should stay up and progress the boss, and then whoever dies first, either we die of exhaustion or the boss dies in that sense.
And for Liquid, they're 2-0 in the War Within. Will this be the first ever expansion sweep in the history of World of Warcraft? That brings us to Manaforge Omega, the last raid of the War Within and the most recent race. The first day of the race, the NA reset was pretty standard, with Liquid players getting into the raid when servers came up, and they're posted up in front of the first boss and Plexus Sentinel. Then, suddenly, one of Liquid's mages gets banned. His name, Hopeful. He gets logged out and receives a message that he had been banned. He looks clearly confused at this point, and Liquid get in touch with a Blizzard contact who said the ban was going to stand.
So basically, when he was in Echo, like 4 or 5 months ago, Instant Dollars, he used to be in Instant Dollars, right? And he was in Echo, and Instant Dollars was progressing Muggsy, and one of their mages' PC blew up. He lives, this part isn't really relevant, but he said they lived an hour away, so he was like going to come over to his house and just play on his setup. And he just eventually, as he said, caved in and he just played his account for Muggsy, didn't kill it, and then played his account one other time and killed Gallywix. And then according to Blizzard, they know exactly what happened. They like clearly were like, he's not getting unbanned. We know what he did. And clearly he's guilty. He did do it. But they said they did not sit on this and time it for today. It just came to their attention recently, which is why what they're saying as far as it being a race ban. So yeah, initial thoughts on that? Insanely fucking stupid that he did that. I mean, just at such an obvious level, it is just so fucking dumb to do that, and not surprising that he got banned for it. So before people start like trying to like point fingers and stuff of like who told Blizzard about it or whatever, I think the moral of the story is like he did something extremely fucking stupid and was obviously going to get banned for it. So it's his fault. Let's keep that a buck, right? It's his fault. It's very dumb, and he knows that.
And Blizzard does allow Hopeful to make a new account, so after 12 hours of level boosting a handful of characters, Hopeful was back in the raid and ready for these splits. But it was a lot of drama at the very beginning, and some people were not happy about this. Manaforge, it's got a lot of splits. Liquid ends up entering Mythic on day 4. Liquid's first kill on the first boss of the raid, Plexus Sentinel, was actually quite a highlight. I remember Yips at this point was basically the only one alive, practically soloing the last minute of the fight, allowing Liquid to kill the boss in one pull. Probably the most hyped first boss kill of all time. but it doesn't really matter through the grand scheme of things. And the next couple of bosses, they're not that hard either. And before you know it, Liquid's staring down Forge Weaver Araz. At this point, there was kind of some information out there on Forge Weaver where Instant Dollars at this time had actually thrown attempts at the boss, and it was widely known that it was not going to be something that you could just completely walk over. So Echo matches Liquid's day one performance, and basically then both of these guilds are going to end up spending pretty much all of their day on Forge Weaver or farming Mythic Plus, where Liquid ends up racking up over 70 attempts on Forge Weaver. They end up doing a decent amount of Mythic Plus breaks, and the boss, Forge Weaver Raz, ends up taking a nerf halfway through Liquid's day, where the original strat on the boss was to use 3 tanks in order to deal with the permanent and very healthy Arcane Echo ads. Since the ads were basically not killable while also doing damage to the boss, Blizzard ends up nerfing the ads HP by 40% and Forge Weaver Raz himself by 5%. This basically kickstarts progression for pretty much all guilds involved on this fight. For Liquid, this allows them to skyrocket their pulls. They change the strategy. They bring in another DPS. They lob a tank, and the boss is still incredibly hard even after the nerfs, with a lot of mechanics coming at you super quickly and needing pretty stupid CC rotation with things like Demon Hunter, Evoker's Oppressing Roar, a lot of stuns, and just Binding Shot. I remember being very good on this fight as well to be able to deal with the entire fight. At the end of the day, the boss is kind of close for Liquid at 1.5%. For Echo, they're, trying to do the slingshot thing where, they go to bed behind and they wake up ahead. And so it's kind of interesting for Echo to see if they're going to be able to capture a world first kill on Forge Weaver Araz. And by the time Liquid ends up waking up, Echo had improved on their previous best, and they had sank 60 pulls into the boss with a 2% best pull, so both of the teams are basically at the exact same point. And over the next hour or so, we would see both Liquid and Echo trying to kill the boss at the same time, getting consecutive low health pulls before Liquid ends up killing the boss an hour into their raid day. Echo did not take too much longer. They ended up killing the boss around 20 minutes after Liquid, so really, really good for Echo, all things considered. Now, it was time for Soul Hunters. Now, this was a boss that originally was flagged as optional, and everybody was kind of confused as to what does an optional boss mean in the context of the Race World First. The Race World First guilds basically decided that we're going to kill all the bosses. It wasn't really optional. It also dropped some pretty powerful loot. Echo ended up spending a couple of pulls here before going to bed. Liquid, though, has almost their entire day to kill as many bosses as reasonably possible. And Soul Hunters would receive a nerf while Liquid was also pulling it, reducing the health of all 3 bosses by 7%. Probably not the largest difference maker, though. Liquid ends up killing the boss in 26 attempts, and they're heading onwards to Fractalus. And for Fractalus, it's kind of weird. The intended strat to kill the boss is with 2 tanks, but after seeing how insane the DPS check was on this fight, Liquid goes and is like, all right, we're gonna one tank this fight. They started one tanking the boss, very similar to what happened with Nexus Princess Kaiveza. In the beginning, the Liquid strat for one tanking this fight was having a Holy Paladin just taunt the boss and bubble taunt. And due to the bug with the boss, the tank mechanic wouldn't spawn the Mythic Wall, essentially skipping a mechanic, a huge deal. But at the same time, I mean, while the strategy is just absolutely insane, Liquid did not swap over to one tanking until it was pretty close to the end of their raid day. They ended up only getting 10 pulls with that strategy. They ended up going to bed with the best attempt of 14%. And at this point in time, Liquid wake up, and they are turbo behind. It was slingshot season again for Echo, and having seen Liquid swap over to a one-tank strategy at the end of the night, Echo ends up adopting the strategy, they make some adjustments, and they have a better strategy than what Liquid did. In Liquid strat, they were breaking a lot of the scary walls that gave a stacking debuff, the Mythic walls, and sometimes they ended up stacking the debuff up to 2 to 3 stacks, putting a lot of extra stress on the healers. Echo ended up breaking basically none of them, opting for a much safer strategy while still maintaining the one tank. Echo ends up killing the boss first with this strategy. They also have killed Soul Hunters at this point in time. Method, on the other hand, also finishes Fractalus World second 4 hours later, basically yoinking the strategy from Echo. And for Liquid, they wake up and, they're behind. They're in 3rd place. And so, shit kind of hits the fan. Liquid just got completely outstratted on what is essentially just an easy patchwork fight. At the same time, we have 2 end bosses left, right? We have 2 bosses left. Nexus King Salhadar, the penultimate encounter, and Demencius, the final encounter. And it's hard to really know how difficult both of these encounters were. And Salhadar, he actually ended up being fairly tricky. There's a lot of stuff that can actually go wrong in this encounter. Moving Bloodlust was something that was fairly common. I remember there were intermission platforms that if you didn't have all 20 players alive, you would fairly regularly just miss the damage check on the intermission platforms. We're pretty close to the reset as well, so it is a high degree of likelihood that an extra reset worth of gear is going to be happening for both Echo and Liquid, trying to see what's going on with that. And for Liquid, they ended up spending a decent amount of time progressing Salhadar. They ended up ending their first reset with a best pull of 62% in Phase 3. Echo, they continue to kind of pull the boss on their reset 1, and Echo goes to bed with Salhadar at 30% into Phase 3. So Echo, they're taking that advantage that they have from Fractalus, and they're really starting to put their foot on the gas and trying to choke out Liquid from a world first Salhadar kill even. So the reset hits, and Liquid's farm actually goes pretty well. All things considered, they end up not taking too much time. There are still some chores that are left to be done. There are some crests that are yet to be gained. There's some, crafting profession gear that needs to be spent occasionally. And for Liquid, after all of this re-clear and after this influx in gear, it's kind of crazy. They end up finishing off Nexus King Salhadar in 20 pulls, ending their pull count at 108 in total. They actually had a really clean strategy for how to deal with the Starkiller swings and where to place their orbiting planets around the room. This was one that Echo ended up copying. Initially, Echo was doing some really weird strategy with all of their orb placements, but the Liquid strategy seemed like it was going to be a little bit superior, and so basically all the other guilds were going to be going on to copy that. So Salhadar's dead for Liquid, and for the next few days, they're going to be banging down the door of Dimensius to see if they can finish off this race and go where we've never seen them go before with an expansion sweep. And Echo, they would basically not be any less on their reset. They start off their day with splits, they smash the re-clear, and they're back in front of Nexus King Salhadar at 3 p.m. local time. 10 hours after the start of their day, they get him killed off rather quickly. And with Liquid and Echo both starting to raid at the exact same time, they're on Dimensius at the exact same time. Echo's able to down Nexus King Salhadar world second rather quickly, and we both guilds trying to figure out phase 1 of Dimensius at the same time. Just talk about Dimensius for a little bit. Even from day 1 of the raid releasing and seeing Dimensius on many difficulties, you could actually tell that this is one of the most visually stunning bosses of all time. People compared it to a Final Fantasy boss. You end up being allowed to fly through space, and you dodge comets that are ended up flying at you in phase 2. You end up having a phase 3 where you have to coordinate soaks and drop debuffs as the room gets smaller and smaller. And this race, it was actually shaping up to be an all-timer if the tuning on Dimensius was right. And for the first real day of Dimensius, Echo had reached the start of the second phase after getting their gear from their re-clear. Liquid, on the other hand, they ended up having a full day on Dimensius himself. They ended up managed to reach the second part of P2, one of the intermission platforms. Next day, it's more of the same. Echo gets a couple of good pulls in phase 2. Then they push into phase 3 even on some of their attempts with not all the players alive. Obviously, it's not going to be a kill, but everybody's, seeing through the fight, at least. You're seeing through all of the phases. Echo ends up swapping some of their comps. They end up playing like Feral Druid at the beginning, but they end up swapping basically to the same composition that Liquid was running. Double DK and Double Evoker were notably actually required for this encounter. Double Evoker for rescues on your healers to be able to meet the heal checks in phase 1. Double Death Knight for the phase 2 add grips that were absolutely required. So both of these comps, it was basically just like, how are we fitting in Death Knights? How are we fitting in Evokers? Then where are we getting our raid buffs from? So everybody's basically seeing through the entirety of the fight. Not seeing to the end rage yet, but we're getting kind of close there. And up until this point, guilds fighting Dimensius, they were basically using Bloodlust on pull. It was kind of used to push through phase 1 and see further into the fight. Phase 1 had an overlap at the very end of P1 that if you didn't beat, you were likely to have people die. It was possible to beat it, and it was possible to outplay it, yet at the same time, the safe thing to do is to just lust phase 1. Maybe the Bloodlust is going to have to be moved. And so then the guilds start to look at the tuning of phase 3, the HP on the boss. And it's unfortunate, but the Bloodlust actually needed to get moved to the start of phase 3 where the boss takes 100% increased damage. And this basically meant that every guild had to re-progress the early parts of the fight without the safety of the Bloodlust for those adds that we were talking about earlier. And this is where things start to hit the fan, where basically guilds are just chain wiping in phase 1, where you're just praying that phase 2 is consistent. Phase 2 is never really that consistent, but you're just praying that you can get through phase 2 on the 1 in 10 attempts that you make it through phase 1 without the Bloodlust. And so yeah, Echo and Liquid have basically seen to the end of the fight. They needed the Bloodlust. The health on the boss was going to be too much. And so basically we're in a situation where the first guild that can turn their 1 out of 10 attempts coming out of phase 1 into 1 out of 5 attempts coming out of phase 1 and continue to see to the end of the fight, they are likely to be your Race World First champions for Manaforge Omega. And because of the intense difficulty in phase 3, the guilds would also choose to use what is called a healer lust, where basically people would stand on the platform, get themselves pre-sated, lust for themselves at the start of phase 1 to make sure that they can get bloodlust back again for the end of the fight, where basically the healers didn't need the bloodlust during the 100% damage amp. Instead, they wanted it later on Dimensius. This is something that takes a lot of time and is really, really stupid, so guilds try to avoid doing this basically until you're ready to kill the boss. That way you don't waste too much time. And so you're pulling out all the stops. Day 12 of the race comes. Echo is eager to retake their title as the best guild in the world, and for Liquid, they're trying to complete the trifecta and sweep all 3 raids in the War Within expansion. Echo, having seen the pulls that Liquid had on the Enrage late into P3, they were charging forwards. And Echo, they were steadily getting lower and lower pulls, going down percent by percent every single pull. And Echo, they were playing really well now. And if Liquid wanted to stand a chance, they had to wake up and be locked in from the start. Liquid had gone to bed the day before with a 17% best pull, and 30 minutes before they woke up, Echo had just wiped at 12%. But Echo, they mean business now. And with the raid going longer and longer, and they're going later and later, we're in a familiar waters, pulling late into the night. This is very Fyrak-esque, where basically both of the guilds are pulling at the exact same time, where, you know, we are in single-digit HP territory. And at the start of the raid, Liquid is unfortunately going to have issues pushing through to phase 3, wiping a bunch of times in phase 1, just proving how inconsistent it can be. And meanwhile, on the other monitor, you can actually see Echo getting lower and lower pulls. Echo's a 5% wipe. Then Echo's a 4% wipe a couple pulls later. Liquid kind of get their shit into gear. They end up having a 13% wipe. But Echo, 3%. Oh, hold on. Then Liquid procs another late wipe, getting the boss down to 3%. And then Echo wipes at 0.3%. And then they wipe again at 0.5%. And so these pulls are so close that basically it could be anybody's game. No matter who wins, and as a viewer experience, this was probably the greatest Race World First yet. So then with Echo pulling the boss past 1 a.m. local time, and after consecutive grueling wipes where there were only margins away from killing the boss, we would see Liquid finish Dimensius on a really god-tier pull and complete their expansion sweep.
Atlas, leave Timber dead, leave Timber dead. Let's fucking go! Let's go! Come on.
Holy shit! Let's go!
It has never been done before. A full sweep of an expansion. Team Liquid down Dimensius, world first.
That is a Coinbase world first kill. They have swept the War Within, never been done before. Back to back to back. The Raiders are joined. They have worked so hard for this moment.
And even after losing, Echo continued to raid for a couple of hours to try to secure World Tech, and I think they stopped pulling like 4 a.m. or something. And then after 4 a.m., they went to bed. They woke back up. They killed the boss pretty early in the morning for their World Second, but basically anything other than World First is unacceptable for these Race World First guilds. So very, very saddening situation for the boys from Europe. But congratulations to Liquid in that regard. I mean, it's a huge deal to be able to sweep an expansion. All right, well, if you made it this far, you're legally required to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Basically, here's what's going on. If you enjoyed this kind of content, I got great news. On March 24th, the opening of Void Spire and the Dream Rift is going to be happening on Mythic. On March 31st, the opening of the March of Kel'Danas is going to be opening on Mythic. So make sure to check out both twitch.tv/TeamLiquid and twitch.tv/echo_esports for more Race World First action. And I'm going to see you guys there. Goodbye.